Welcome, fellow dreamer. This evening, we're going to explore the remarkable journey of mapmaking, from ancient attempts to capture the world on clay and parchment to the sophisticated charts that guided explorers across uncharted seas. We'll discover how humanity transformed blank spaces into detailed landscapes, one careful line at a time. Accompanied by soothing music and abstract imagery, we'll be uncovering little-known wonders and fascinating stories that gently feed your curiosity as you drift towards sleep. And now take a deep breath, let your body sink into comfort, and allow your mind to rest and your eyes to close as the tale unfolds before you. Long before there were maps as we know them, before paper or parchment, before ink could flow across a smooth surface, human beings felt the need to mark their world. They wanted to remember where things were, to show others the locations that mattered, to hold space itself in their hands. The story of maps begins not with grand explorers or learned scholars, but with ordinary people scratching lines into the most humble of materials. Wet clay. Picture the ancient land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers some 5,000 years ago. The Mesopotamians who lived in this fertile region had developed something remarkable: cities, agriculture, writing itself. And with these innovations came something else, something quieter but equally profound. They needed to keep track of who owned which fields, where water flowed, how far one settlement lay from another. Memory alone would not suffice. Disputes arose, boundaries blurred with time and changing seasons. So they pressed their styluses into clay tablets, creating what we now recognize as the earliest surviving maps. These first maps were not elaborate documents. A map from the ancient Sumerian city of Lagash, dating to around 2300 BCE, shows something wonderfully practical: property lines. Simple marks indicated plots of land, with notations describing their owners and sizes. The clay tablet itself could fit in your palm, yet it contained a spatial truth that transformed clay into territory, marks into meaning. The mapmaker had done something extraordinary, taken the three-dimensional world that stretched across hills and fields and compressed it into a flat surface that could be held, stored, and consulted whenever needed. Another Mesopotamian map, this one from the city of Nippur around 1500 BCE, reveals an evolving sophistication. It shows not just boundaries, but buildings, temples, walls, and water features. The city itself appears in plan view, as if seen from above by an observer who could somehow float in the sky. Streets run between structures. The great temple complex sits prominently displayed. Canals that brought life-giving water are carefully marked. This was no longer just about ownership. This was about understanding the layout of urban space, about seeing the city as a complete system rather than a series of individual experiences along familiar walking paths. Far to the west, along the banks of another great river, the Egyptians were developing their own relationship with spatial representation. The Nile flooded each year with reliable generosity, depositing rich soil across the farmlands, but also washing away boundary markers. Property lines disappeared under water and silt. When the floods receded, how could anyone prove where one field ended and another began? The answer was measurement and mapping. Egyptian surveyors, sometimes called rope stretchers for their primary tool, would re-establish boundaries after each inundation using careful records and geometric principles. They created land registers that combined written descriptions with simple spatial diagrams. These were not maps in the decorative sense, but they served the essential cartographic function. They represented where things were in relation to each other, creating a reference that existed independent of the physical landscape itself. Some Egyptian maps served different purposes entirely. The Turin Papyrus, dating to around 1150 BCE, shows something unexpected: a map of gold mines and stone quarries in the eastern desert. Here we see hills rendered in profile with different colors of stone indicated, paths wind between the mountains. A written note describes the quality of stone to be found in particular locations. This remarkable document demonstrates that early maps were not confined to recording what already existed in settled areas. They also served as tools for resource extraction, for remembering where valuable materials could be found in otherwise featureless wilderness. What is most striking about these ancient maps is not their accuracy by modern standards, but rather the conceptual leap they represent. The world as experienced is continuous, three-dimensional, and immersive. A map, by contrast, is discrete, flat, and observed. To create a map, the mapmaker must perform a kind of mental magic, stepping outside their embodied experience of moving through space and instead imagining that space as if seen from an impossible vantage point. The symbols used on these early maps reveal the abstraction at work. A wavy line means water, though it looks nothing like actual water. A rectangle represents a building, though buildings are not flat shapes, but volumes with walls and roofs. Circles might mark wells or sacred sites. Each symbol is a compact agreement between mapmaker and map reader. This mark stands for that feature. Once this symbolic language is established, incredibly complex information can be conveyed in simple marks. We see this same impulse towards spatial representation in other ancient cultures, though the artifacts are fewer and more fragmentary. Cave paintings occasionally show spatial relationships between hunting grounds. Carved petroglyphs sometimes indicate routes through difficult terrain. Polynesian navigators created stick charts from coconut fiber and shells, showing wave patterns and island locations, though these maps recorded something more subtle than land. They showed the feel of the ocean, the patterns that a skilled navigator could read. What all these early attempts share is the recognition that space itself is a kind of information that can be recorded, stored, and transmitted. A farmer in Mesopotamia could show a buyer exactly which field was for sale without walking there. An Egyptian administrator could calculate tax obligations based on land area shown in records. A mining expedition could return to productive sites in the desert years later. Memory became permanent. Knowledge became transferable. These clay tablets and papyrus sheets were not yet trying to show the whole world. They mapped the known, the nearby, the practical. They answered immediate questions: where is my field? How do I reach the quarry? What lies within the city walls? They were tools for living in specific places, not for understanding Earth as a whole. Yet in their modest practicality, these earliest maps established principles that would echo through all subsequent cartography. They established that space could be represented symbolically. They demonstrated that measurements could be recorded and used to reconstruct spatial relationships. They showed that maps could serve multiple purposes: legal documentation, administrative planning, resource management, and navigation. And perhaps most importantly, they proved that abstract representation of space was not just possible, but immensely useful. Useful enough that cultures separated by vast distances and centuries all independently arrived at similar solutions. As these ancient civilizations developed their simple maps, they could not have imagined what would follow. They could not foresee that humans would eventually map entire continents, then the whole globe, and finally even venture beyond Earth itself. But in their careful marks on clay and papyrus, they took the first steps on a journey that would ultimately transform humanity's relationship with the planet. They learned to see space from outside themselves, to represent what they knew and to share that knowledge across time. The map, in all its future complexity, was born in these humble beginnings, where human hands first dared to capture the world in miniature. The ancient Greeks possessed something that set them apart in the history of mapmaking, an insatiable curiosity about the nature of the world itself, combined with a faith in mathematics as the language of understanding. Where earlier civilizations had mapped what they could see and measure directly, Greek philosophers dared to ask bigger questions. How large was the Earth? What shape did it take? Could the entire world be represented on a single surface through the power of geometry? In the bustling port cities of Ionia, where trade ships brought tales from distant shores and scholars gathered to debate in open-air markets, a new kind of thinking emerged. These Greek minds looked at the heavens and the horizon with fresh eyes, convinced that observation and reason could unlock mysteries that had never before been contemplated. They transformed mapmaking from a practical tool for recording boundaries into something far more ambitious, an attempt to understand Earth's place in the cosmos and humanity's position upon its surface. Anaximander of Miletus, living in the 6th century before the Common Era, is credited with creating what many consider the first true map of the world, based on theoretical principles rather than direct observation alone. He imagined the Earth as a cylinder floating in space, with humanity living on the flat top surface. This may sound peculiar to us now, but it represented a leap of imagination. Anaximander wasn't simply drawing what he saw. He was constructing a model of reality based on logical deduction. His map divided the known world into rough sections, showing the Mediterranean Sea at its center, with Europe to the north and Asia to the east and south. Though the map itself has not survived, ancient writers describe it with a mixture of admiration and critique, as later generations of Greeks would refine and challenge his vision. What made the Greek approach revolutionary was this willingness to theorize, to propose models and then test them against observation. They didn't simply accept the world as it appeared. They measured, calculated, and argued about their findings with a passion that echoes through the centuries. In their gymnasiums and academies, beneath olive trees and colonnaded walkways, debates about the nature of the Earth became as common as discussions of poetry and politics. Eratosthenes of Cyrene took this mathematical approach to its most famous expression in the 3rd century before the Common Era. As the chief librarian of the Great Library of Alexandria, he had access to reports, measurements, and observations from across the known world. He heard a fascinating piece of information. In the city of Syene, far to the south along the Nile, the sun at noon on the summer solstice shone directly down a deep well, casting no shadow. Yet in Alexandria, at that same moment, vertical objects did cast shadows. Here was a puzzle that a mathematical mind could solve. If the Earth were flat, the sun's rays would strike everywhere at the same angle. But if the Earth were a sphere, as many Greek philosophers had already proposed, then the sun's rays would arrive at different angles at different locations. Eratosthenes measured the angle of the shadow in Alexandria with careful precision. He knew the distance between Alexandria and Syene, measured by professional pacers who walked the route. With these two pieces of information and elegant geometry, he calculated the circumference of the entire Earth. The number he arrived at was remarkably close to what we know today to be accurate. Different ancient sources report his conclusion in different units, making the exact figure debated by historians, but his result was within a small percentage of Earth's actual circumference. Think of that for a moment. More than 2,000 years ago, using nothing but shadows, angles, and logic, a human being determined the size of the planet. No spacecraft, no satellite, no sophisticated instruments, just careful observation and mathematical reasoning. This achievement did more than satisfy curiosity. It provided mapmakers with a framework. If you knew the size of the Earth, you could begin to place locations on it with meaningful proportions. You could start to represent distances not just as many days' journey, but as measurable portions of a spherical surface. The Greeks also developed the concepts that would eventually become our latitude and longitude system. They noticed that the sun's height in the sky changed as you traveled north or south, providing a natural reference system. They divided the world into climate zones, not based on temperature as we use the term today, but on the angle of sunlight. These parallel bands running east to west became early forms of latitude lines. Longitude proved more elusive. The Greeks understood that you could divide a circle into segments, and they even proposed dividing the Earth's circumference into 360 parts, each representing 1 degree. But determining your position east or west required knowing the time difference between your location and a reference point, which required accurate timekeeping, a problem that wouldn't be solved for another 2 millennia. Hipparchus, working on the island of Rhodes in the 2nd century before the Common Era, pushed these concepts further. He proposed that every location on Earth could be specified by 2 numbers, its position north or south, and its position east or west. He advocated for maps based on astronomical observations, believing that by noting the precise positions of stars and the timing of lunar eclipses as seen from different places, cartographers could establish accurate coordinates. His ideas were brilliant but impractical for his time. The necessary observations simply didn't exist in sufficient detail. Still, the intellectual foundation was established. The Greeks had imagined a spherical Earth divided by a grid of mathematical lines, with positions determinable through measurement and calculation. They had estimated the planet's size with surprising accuracy. They had moved cartography from drawing what you saw to mapping what you could deduce. When Greek knowledge flowed into the hands of Roman scholars and beyond, these mathematical principles traveled with it. Though they would sometimes be forgotten, questioned, or set aside for more practical concerns, the Greek contribution remained foundational. They had shown that the world could be measured, that its secrets yielded to patient observation and clear thinking, and that a map could be more than a picture. It could be a mathematical model of reality itself. As we move forward through the story of maps, we'll see this tension recur again and again. The pull between practical utility and theoretical accuracy, between showing what travelers need to know and representing what the world actually is. The Greeks planted themselves firmly on the side of understanding, and cartography has never quite been the same since. The Greeks had pondered the sphere of the Earth and measured its grand circumference with mathematics and shadow. But the Romans, inheritors of the Mediterranean world, approached maps with an entirely different sensibility. They were builders of roads and aqueducts, organizers of legions and provinces, administrators of the greatest empire the Western world had yet seen. When they looked at a map, they did not ask philosophical questions about the shape of the cosmos. They asked, how do we get from here to there? How many miles? What towns lie along the way? The Roman genius for practical engineering extended naturally to their cartography. While they were certainly aware of Greek geographical theories, the maps they created served the immediate needs of governance, military movement, and commerce. A Roman general planning a campaign did not require a mathematically precise representation of coastlines. He needed to know which roads his legions would march upon, where they might find water, and how many days the journey would require. The most remarkable surviving example of Roman cartographic thinking exists not as an ancient original, but as a medieval copy of what scholars believe was a Roman road map. Known today as the Putinger Table, after the 16th century German humanist who once owned it, this extraordinary document stretches across 11 sections of parchment. If you were to unroll it completely, you would hold a strip more than 20 feet long, but only about a foot high, a dramatically elongated ribbon of the known world. The Putinger Table shows the Roman Empire and beyond, from the Atlantic coast of Iberia to India and Sri Lanka, from Britain to North Africa. But it does so in a way that would baffle anyone expecting a map to look like the world as seen from above. The Mediterranean Sea, that great defining feature of Roman civilization, appears compressed into a narrow blue band, squeezed almost to nothing. Italy stretches sideways, distorted beyond recognition. Distances east to west are expanded enormously, while north to south they are compressed into the narrow format. Yet this strange distortion was not a failure of mapmaking, it was a deliberate choice. The Putinger Table was designed to be rolled and unrolled, consulted section by section, like a scroll. Its purpose was to display the vast network of roads that connected the empire, showing travelers which routes to take and what stations, towns, and landmarks they would encounter along the way. Small illustrations mark important cities depicted as clusters of buildings. Mountain ranges appear as gentle ridges. Rivers wind their way across the landscape. The map is covered with numerals indicating distances between points, measured in Roman miles. These numbers were the map's most practical feature, allowing a traveler to calculate journey times and plan accordingly. A merchant traveling from Rome to Byzantium could trace the route with his finger, adding up the miles between each stopping point, determining where he might spend each night, where he could expect to find fresh horses or provisions. This emphasis on routes rather than shapes characterized Roman cartography. The Romans created what we might call itineraries in visual form. Some surviving examples are purely textual, lists of places along a route with distances between them. Others combined text and simple visual representation, but all shared the same fundamental purpose: facilitating movement through the empire's extraordinary infrastructure. That infrastructure was itself a kind of map written across the landscape. Roman roads connected every corner of the empire, engineered with remarkable precision and built to last millennia. Many still exist today, buried beneath modern highways or walking paths that follow exactly the same courses the Romans surveyed 2,000 years ago. These roads were constructed in straight lines wherever possible, driving directly toward their destinations with characteristic Roman determination. Where they encountered obstacles, mountains, rivers, valleys, Roman engineers deployed their full arsenal of techniques: bridges, tunnels, viaducts, and carefully graded switchbacks. Along these roads, at regular intervals, the Romans established way stations where official travelers could change horses and rest. These stations appear on Roman maps and itineraries, marking the rhythm of travel through the empire. Every 15 or 20 miles, a traveler might expect to find such a station. Larger towns offered fuller amenities: markets, baths, temples. The maps noted these distinctions with different symbols and annotations. The military applications of this cartographic system were obvious and intentional. Roman armies moved with legendary speed and efficiency, in part because they knew exactly where they were going and what they would find along the way. A legion could march from one end of the empire to another following well-mapped routes, knowing in advance where to find water, where the road conditions might slow their progress, where they would camp each night. This information could be compiled into written itineraries that commanders carried with them, simple but effective tools for moving thousands of soldiers and their supply trains across vast distances. The Romans also understood maps as instruments of power and administration. To govern their immense territories, they needed to know what they controlled. Provincial governors required maps showing the extent of their authority, the locations of cities and settlements, the boundaries between one administrative region and another. Tax collectors needed to know where valuable resources could be found. The Roman bureaucracy, with its legendary attention to detail and documentation, naturally embraced cartography as an essential tool. We know from historical sources that there were more elaborate Roman maps that have not survived. The geographer Strabo, writing during the reign of Augustus, described maps displayed in Rome itself. The Emperor Augustus commissioned a map of the entire known world to be displayed in a colonnade near the Tiber River. His general Marcus Agrippa oversaw this project, gathering information from military campaigns, exploration, and existing sources. Though this map itself is lost, we know it was consulted and referenced for generations, a statement of Roman power and geographical knowledge displayed for public viewing. Yet for all their practical achievements, the Romans did not significantly advance theoretical cartography beyond what the Greeks had accomplished. They were content to use Greek geographical knowledge where it suited their purposes, but they did not pursue the mathematical precision that had interested scholars like Eratosthenes or Ptolemy. The Latin geographical texts that have survived tend to compile information about places, their locations, their characteristics, their distances from one another, rather than to advance new theories about how to represent the curved Earth on a flat surface. This practicality was quintessentially Roman. Why spend time perfecting theoretical models when roads needed building, provinces needed governing, and armies needed moving? The Roman approach to maps reflected their approach to empire itself: systematic, organized, focused on tangible results. Their roads quite literally led everywhere that mattered, connecting a network of territories larger and more diverse than any previous civilization had managed to hold together. Their maps, in turn, documented and facilitated that remarkable achievement. As the Roman Empire gradually transformed over the centuries, its cartographic traditions would be passed down, preserved, and transformed by those who came after. The format of the Putinger table itself survived long enough to be copied in medieval times. The practical knowledge of routes and distances continued to matter, even as the political structures that had created those routes evolved into something quite different. In the monasteries and scriptoria of medieval Europe, scribes would create new kinds of maps, infused with different purposes and reflecting different worldviews entirely. But they would still carry within them echoes of Roman roads, stretching toward distant horizons. As the Roman Empire receded and Europe entered the Middle Ages, the nature of mapmaking underwent a profound transformation. The practical, road-focused maps that had guided legions and merchants gave way to something entirely different. Maps became windows into a worldview where geography and theology intertwined, where the physical landscape of Earth merged seamlessly with the spiritual landscape of faith. Picture a monastery in the 13th century. Pale morning light filters through narrow windows, illuminating a scriptorium where monks labor over manuscripts. In one corner, a cartographer bends over a large sheet of vellum, carefully drawing a map that would look peculiar to modern eyes. The world he creates is circular, divided into 3 sections by a T-shaped arrangement of waterways. This is the Mappa Mundi, the map of the world as medieval Christians understood it. These TO maps, as scholars now call them, followed a consistent pattern that revealed how medieval Europeans conceived their place in creation. The circle represented the known world, encircled by ocean. The horizontal bar of the T depicted the Mediterranean Sea, while the vertical stroke showed the combined course of the Nile and the Don rivers. These waters divided the world into 3 continents. Asia occupied the entire top half, while Europe and Africa shared the bottom portion. At the very top of the map, where modern cartographers might place north, medieval mapmakers positioned east, the direction of paradise. Jerusalem stood at the precise center of these maps, the hub around which all geography revolved. This placement was not accidental or arbitrary, but reflected a deep conviction about the city's cosmic significance. Medieval mapmakers worked from scriptural passages and theological texts that described Jerusalem as the navel of the world. To place it anywhere else would have been unthinkable, a contradiction of divine truth as they understood it. The largest and most elaborate of these medieval maps still surviving is the Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around 1300. Measuring more than 5 feet across, drawn on a single sheet of vellum, it represents the culmination of medieval cartographic tradition. Walking around this map today, preserved in Hereford Cathedral in England, one enters a different mental universe. Here, geography serves as a framework for displaying all of human knowledge, history, and belief. The Hereford map teems with details that blend the real and the mythical without distinction. Cities and regions that actually existed appear alongside locations from biblical accounts and classical legends. The Red Sea is colored red. The Tower of Babel rises prominently. The Garden of Eden appears at the map's eastern edge, depicted as a circular island. Alongside recognizable animals and peoples, the map shows creatures from travelers' tales and ancient texts. People with faces in their chests, others with enormous feet they used as parasols, dog-headed men, and beings with a single enormous eye. These inclusions were not signs of ignorance or gullibility. Medieval cartographers worked with different priorities than modern mapmakers. Accuracy of scale and proportion mattered less than completeness of knowledge. A map should show everything that existed in the world, whether that existence was physical, historical, or spiritual. The Hereford map includes scenes from classical mythology, events from the Old Testament, and locations mentioned by ancient Roman writers. It functions simultaneously as a map, an encyclopedia, a biblical commentary, and a moral guide. Other medieval maps took slightly different approaches, but shared this fundamental character. The Ebstorf map, created in Germany around the same period as the Hereford map, and even larger, depicted Christ's body as containing the world itself. His head appeared at the top in the east, his hands at the north and south edges, his feet at the west. The entire world existed, literally, within the divine. This map was destroyed during World War II, though photographs and copies preserve its design. Not all medieval maps embraced such elaborate symbolism. Monasteries and pilgrimage centers produced simpler route maps showing roads to holy sites. Sailors around the Mediterranean created their own practical charts, which we will explore further in later chapters. But these functional maps served specific, limited purposes. When medieval scholars wanted to show the world in its entirety, they created maps that reflected their understanding of creation's structure and meaning. Islamic cartographers of the same period, working in the sophisticated intellectual centers of Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, produced maps with very different characteristics. While European monks placed Jerusalem at the world's center and oriented their maps toward east, Islamic cartographers often centered their maps on Mecca and placed south at the top. Their maps incorporated mathematical principles and measurement techniques that made them considerably more accurate in depicting distances and proportions. Yet these too were products of specific cultural and religious perspectives, showing how all cartography reflects the worldview of its creators. The medieval European approach to mapmaking would eventually give way to the observation-based, mathematically precise cartography of later centuries. But for several hundred years, these maps of faith and imagination represented the dominant way of visualizing the world in Western Europe. They were not failed attempts at modern maps, but successful attempts at something different entirely. They showed the world as a meaningful place, charged with significance, where every location had its role in the divine plan. As you drift towards sleep, imagine standing in a quiet cathedral, gazing at one of these great circular maps. The detail draws your eye constantly onward, each glance revealing some new marvel, some unexpected juxtaposition of the familiar and the fabulous. The map tells you that the world is stranger, richer, and more purposeful than mere physical geography could capture. In its own way, this too was a kind of truth, a representation not just of where things were, but of what they meant. The medieval map was, above all, an affirmation that the world made sense, that creation had structure and purpose, that everything fit together in a coherent whole. As the centuries turned and new methods of exploration and measurement emerged, this comforting certainty would give way to maps that showed the world with increasing physical accuracy, but perhaps less philosophical coherence. The next chapters of cartographic history would be written by scholars who preserved ancient knowledge while pushing the boundaries of what maps could show and how precisely they could show it. As the Christian kingdoms of medieval Europe turned inward, drawing their maps as expressions of faith with Jerusalem at the center, scholars in another part of the world were taking a different path. In the lands stretching from Spain to Persia, from North Africa to Central Asia, a remarkable intellectual awakening was underway. The Islamic Golden Age, spanning roughly from the 8th to the 14th centuries, saw scholars who not only preserved the geographical knowledge of the ancient Greeks, but built upon it in ways that would reshape cartography for centuries to come. In the Great House of Wisdom in Baghdad, translators worked by lamplight, carefully rendering Greek manuscripts into Arabic. The works of Ptolemy, which had largely vanished from Western European consciousness, found new life in these translation efforts during the 9th century. But these scholars did far more than simply copy what came before. They questioned, tested, and improved upon the ancient knowledge, combining it with their own observations gathered from the vast Islamic world that stretched across 3 continents. The Islamic scholars had an advantage that few civilizations before them possessed. Their world was connected by trade routes, pilgrimage paths, and administrative networks that spanned an enormous geographic range. Merchants traveled from Cordoba to China. Pilgrims journeyed from West Africa to Mecca. Government officials moved between provinces that encompassed deserts, mountains, coastlines, and river valleys. All of this movement generated knowledge, and the scholars of the Islamic world became masters at collecting, organizing, and representing that knowledge cartographically. One of the earliest of these scholar geographers was Al-Khwarizmi, working in Baghdad in the early 9th century. He created a map of the known world that corrected many of Ptolemy's errors, particularly regarding the length of the Mediterranean Sea, which Ptolemy had overestimated. Al-Khwarizmi's work included coordinates for numerous locations, and his careful mathematical approach reflected the Islamic world's sophisticated understanding of astronomy and mathematics. His name, incidentally, would eventually give us the word algorithm, a testament to the mathematical precision these scholars brought to their work. As centuries passed, Islamic cartography continued to flourish. Al-Masudi, traveling extensively in the 10th century, gathered geographical information from East Africa to India, from the Caspian Sea to the Arabian Peninsula. His descriptions of lands, peoples, and natural phenomena added depth to the growing body of Islamic geographical knowledge. He wrote of monsoon winds, ocean currents, and the relationship between geography and climate, observations that would later find their way onto maps. But perhaps no Islamic cartographer achieved quite the same lasting influence as Abu Abdullah Muhammad al-Idrisi, who worked in the 12th century at an unexpected location, the Norman court of King Roger II of Sicily. This collaboration itself tells us something important about the medieval world, which was often more connected and cosmopolitan than we might imagine. Roger II, ruling over a kingdom that blended Norman, Byzantine, Greek, and Arab cultures, wanted the most accurate map of the known world that could be created. For this ambitious project, he turned to Al-Idrisi, already renowned as a scholar and traveler. Al-Idrisi spent 15 years creating his masterwork, completed in 1154. The map he produced, along with an accompanying geographical text, represented the culmination of Islamic cartographic knowledge. He drew upon classical sources, certainly, but also upon information gathered from travelers, merchants, and sailors who passed through Sicily's cosmopolitan ports. He sent researchers to verify information and resolve contradictions between different sources. The result was a circular world map, engraved on a silver disc weighing approximately 70 pounds, accompanied by 70 detailed regional maps. What made Al-Idrisi's work remarkable was its scope and accuracy. His representation of the Mediterranean coast was exceptionally precise, based on accumulated knowledge from centuries of maritime trade. His depiction of North Africa included details of rivers, mountains, and settlements that demonstrated genuine familiarity with the terrain. He described the length of the Nile with greater accuracy than any European cartographer of his time. His maps extended eastward to show India and even hints of Southeast Asia, incorporating knowledge that had traveled along the Indian Ocean trade routes. Following an Arabic cartographic convention, Al-Idrisi oriented his maps with south at the top, which can initially confuse modern viewers accustomed to north-oriented maps. But the orientation mattered less than the information contained within. His work included approximately 2,500 place names and detailed descriptions of climate, culture, and commerce. He described the sources of rivers, the extent of mountain ranges, and the products of different regions, creating not just a map, but a comprehensive geographical encyclopedia. The text that accompanied Al-Idrisi's maps, often called the Book of Roger, provided travelers with practical information about distances between cities, road conditions, and local customs. Unlike the symbolic medieval European maps of the same period, Al-Idrisi's work served practical purposes for anyone actually planning to travel. A merchant could use it to plan a route. An ambassador could learn what to expect in distant lands. A scholar could understand the relationship between different regions of the known world. Islamic cartographers also made important advances in mathematical cartography. They refined calculations of latitude using astronomical observations, measuring the height of the sun and stars with instruments like the astrolabe, which had been perfected in the Islamic world. They understood that the Earth was a sphere and grappled with the challenge of representing that sphere on a flat surface, experimenting with various projection techniques. The influence of Islamic cartography eventually flowed back into Europe through multiple channels. Sicily itself, where Al-Idrisi worked, became a point of transmission. The Iberian Peninsula, where Christian and Islamic civilizations interacted for centuries, saw the exchange of geographical knowledge. Later, as European scholars gained access to Arabic texts, they encountered a tradition of geographical scholarship that had remained vital while their own had stagnated. In the quiet hours of the night, we might imagine Al-Idrisi in his Sicilian workshop, surrounded by reports from travelers, consulting astronomical tables, carefully inscribing place names onto silver. Outside, the Mediterranean lapped at Sicily's shores, those same waters that connected the diverse cultures whose knowledge he was synthesizing. His work represented not just one culture's understanding of geography, but a true meeting point of civilizations, where information flowed across boundaries of language, religion, and politics in service of a larger goal: understanding the shape and nature of the world we inhabit. As this tradition of precise, practical, mathematically informed cartography flourished in the Islamic world, far to the east, another great civilization was developing its own sophisticated approaches to representing space and territory, following principles that had emerged independently from yet another well of human curiosity about our planet's geography. While scholars in Baghdad and Sicily were refining their understanding of the Mediterranean world and the lands beyond, another great civilization had been quietly developing its own sophisticated approach to representing the Earth. Far to the east, Chinese cartographers had been creating maps for more than 1,000 years, following principles and techniques that arose independently from those in the West, yet arriving at remarkably similar solutions to the fundamental challenges of showing three-dimensional space on a flat surface. The earliest Chinese maps that have survived come to us from the 2nd century before the Common Era, discovered in tombs where they were placed to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. These ancient maps, drawn on silk, show regions with military garrisons, administrative districts, and topographical features rendered with surprising attention to proportion and relative distance. Even at this early stage, Chinese mapmakers understood that a map needed to convey not just the existence of places, but their spatial relationships to one another in a way that could be measured and relied upon. What distinguished Chinese cartography most clearly from contemporary mapping traditions elsewhere was its early embrace of the grid system. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, a scholar and minister named Pei Zhu had articulated 6 principles of mapmaking that would guide Chinese cartographers for more than 1,000 years. These principles addressed the fundamental questions every mapmaker must answer: how to represent distance accurately, how to show direction reliably, how to account for elevation and terrain, and how to measure areas correctly. Pei Zhu's approach was methodical and mathematical, treating the map as a quantitative tool rather than merely a qualitative sketch. At the heart of Pei Zhu's method was the grid, a network of squares overlaid on the map that allowed for systematic scaling and measurement. Each square represented a specific distance on the ground, perhaps 100 li, a Chinese unit of distance. This grid system functioned much like the latitude and longitude lines that Greek scholars had conceived centuries earlier, but it was applied more consistently and practically to actual mapmaking in China than geographic coordinates were being used in medieval Europe at the same time. The grid transformed the map from an artistic impression into a measuring instrument, one that could be used to calculate distances between any 2 points simply by counting squares and applying basic arithmetic. The practical applications of this systematic approach were evident in the maps produced during the Tang dynasty, which flourished from the 7th through 10th centuries. Administrative maps showed the empire's provinces and prefectures, the locations of cities and towns, the courses of rivers, and the paths of roads. Military maps charted defensive positions and supply routes. Estate maps delineated agricultural lands with precision sufficient for taxation and legal disputes. In each case, the underlying grid provided a framework that ensured consistency and accuracy. As dynasties rose and fell, the tradition of careful cartography persisted and evolved. The Song dynasty, which held power from the 10th through 13th centuries, saw remarkable advances in printing technology that made maps more widely available. Carved wooden blocks could reproduce maps repeatedly, spreading geographical knowledge beyond the imperial court to scholars, merchants, and educated officials throughout the realm. These printed maps often combined topographical information with historical annotations, creating documents that told stories about the landscape as well as depicting its physical form. One of the most impressive achievements of Chinese cartography emerged during the Ming dynasty in the 14th and 15th centuries. The De Ming Honey II, or Comprehensive Map of the Great Ming, presented a view of the known world as understood from the Chinese perspective. At the center, naturally, lay China itself, rendered in considerable detail with its provinces, major cities, rivers, and mountain ranges. Surrounding this central region, the map showed neighboring lands. Korea to the northeast, the kingdoms of Southeast Asia to the south, the steppes of Central Asia to the west, and even portions of India and the Middle East, drawn from accounts of travelers and traders who had journeyed along the ancient Silk Roads. What strikes the modern observer about such maps is their systematic organization and their attempt to reconcile information from diverse sources into a coherent whole. Chinese cartographers faced the same challenge as their counterparts everywhere: how to integrate second-hand reports and travelers' tales into maps of distant regions they could not survey directly. The accuracy inevitably diminished with distance from the mapmaker's home territory, yet the attempt itself reveals a sophisticated understanding that the world extended far beyond one's immediate experience, and that this larger world could, at least in principle, be systematically documented. The maritime expeditions of Admiral Zheng He in the early 15th century expanded Chinese geographical knowledge dramatically. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He led 7 massive naval expeditions that reached the coasts of Southeast Asia, India, the Arabian Peninsula, and East Africa. These voyages of exploration, which predated the Portuguese voyages around Africa by several decades, generated detailed navigational charts and coastal maps. The records describe sophisticated navigation techniques using compass bearings, depth soundings, and careful observations of coastal landmarks. Though many of the original charts from these expeditions have been lost, later compilations preserve some of their geographical information, showing sea routes marked with compass directions and sailing times between ports. Chinese maps also displayed a distinctive artistic sensibility that set them apart from Western cartographic traditions. Mountains were often depicted as small peaked symbols arranged in chains, creating a stylized but recognizable representation of terrain. Rivers flowed in graceful curves, their relative sizes indicating their importance to navigation and agriculture. Cities were marked with rectangular symbols representing walls, a reminder that many Chinese urban centers were indeed walled compounds. The combination of quantitative accuracy in spatial relationships with qualitative artistic representation created maps that were both functional tools and beautiful objects. The tradition of detailed terrestrial mapping continued through the centuries, with each dynasty contributing refinements and updates to the geographical knowledge of the empire and its surrounding regions. Even as European explorers were charting sea routes around Africa and across the Atlantic, Chinese surveyors were producing remarkably precise maps of their own vast territories using traditional methods that had proven their worth over more than a millennium. The parallel development of cartographic science in China demonstrates that the human impulse to map one's world and the mathematical and observational skills required to do so accurately arise independently across cultures when the need and opportunity coincide. As we prepare to turn our attention westward again to the Mediterranean sailors who were developing their own revolutionary approach to sea charts, it is worth remembering that mapmaking has never been the province of a single culture or tradition. The maps we use today descend from multiple lineages of geographical thought, each contributing techniques and insights that eventually merged into our modern understanding of how to represent our world on paper and now on screens with ever-increasing precision and detail. While Chinese cartographers developed their sophisticated grid systems and quantitative methods in the East, an entirely different revolution in mapmaking was quietly taking shape along the busy harbors and trading ports of the Mediterranean Sea. This transformation would emerge not from scholars in courts or monasteries, but from the practical needs of sailors navigating the complex coastlines between Europe, North Africa, and the Levant. In the 13th century, something remarkable began appearing in the maritime cities of Genoa, Venice, Majorca, and other Mediterranean ports. These were the Portolan charts, sea maps unlike anything that had come before them. The word itself came from the Italian Portolano, referring to written sailing directions that described ports and coastal features. But the charts that bore this name were far more than simple written instructions. They represented a completely new approach to depicting the world, one born from direct observation and the accumulated knowledge of generations of sailors. Picture one of these early charts spread across a ship captain's table. Unlike the symbolic medieval maps being created in European monasteries at the same time, Portolan charts showed coastlines with stunning accuracy. The shores of the Mediterranean, traced in brown or black ink, followed the actual contours of the land with a precision that would not be surpassed for centuries. Every inlet, every peninsula, every harbor appeared in its proper relationship to its neighbors. The Red Sea stretched southward, Italy's boot extended into the blue-tinted waters, and the islands of the Aegean scattered across the chart just as they did across the actual sea. What made these charts immediately distinctive to anyone viewing them was their web of intersecting lines radiating across the surface. These were rhumb lines, compass bearings that spread out from multiple compass roses placed strategically around the chart. 16 or 32 lines would extend from each rose, creating an intricate geometric pattern that overlay the coastlines like an elaborate spider's web. To the modern eye, these lines might seem decorative, but to a medieval sailor, they were essential navigational tools. The way a navigator used these lines was beautifully simple. If a captain in Genoa wished to sail to Alexandria, he would place one point of his dividers on his current location and the other on his destination. Then, following the line he had traced, he would find the rhumb line that most closely matched his direction of travel. The angle of that line told him which compass bearing to follow. As long as he maintained that bearing, he would reach his destination, adjusting as needed when the coastline required him to alter course. The origins of Portolan charts remain somewhat mysterious, which perhaps adds to their allure. The earliest surviving examples appeared suddenly in the late 13th century, already remarkably sophisticated. The Carta Pisana, dated to approximately 1275, shows the Mediterranean with such accuracy that it must have been the product of a long tradition of development. Yet we have almost no record of the charts that must have preceded it. It seems likely that working sea charts had been evolving throughout the 13th century, but these practical tools were used, worn out, and discarded, leaving no trace for historians to find. The creation of a Portolan chart required synthesizing information from countless voyages. Sailors would record distances between ports, measured in the time it took to sail between them under typical conditions. They noted compass bearings carefully. They observed and remembered the appearance of coastlines, the locations of hazards, the positions of safe anchorages. This knowledge was collected, compared, and gradually refined into charts that represented the collective wisdom of the maritime community. The charts themselves were typically drawn on vellum, the treated animal skin that provided a durable surface resistant to the dampness of sea air. Chart makers, who developed into specialized craftsmen, would first lay out the network of rhumb lines with exacting precision, using rulers and compasses to create the geometric framework. Only then would they add the coastlines, working from older charts and from the reports of sailors who had recently traveled particular routes. Place names marched perpendicular to the coast in neat rows, written in black ink for Christian ports and red for those in Muslim lands. The accuracy of these charts for the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts was extraordinary. Modern scholars comparing Portolan charts to satellite images have found that the relative positions of coastal features are remarkably correct, especially considering the tools available to medieval sailors. The charts show some distortions, particularly as they extend toward the Atlantic coasts beyond Gibraltar, but within the Mediterranean itself, they provided sailors with genuinely reliable representations of where they would find land and sea. As Portolan charts evolved, chart makers began extending their scope beyond the Mediterranean. The Atlantic coasts of Europe appeared with increasing detail. North African shores stretched farther to the west. The British Isles took shape at the chart's northern edges. Some later charts showed the Baltic Sea, though with less accuracy than the Mediterranean heartland. Each extension represented new knowledge brought back by venturing sailors, their observations carefully incorporated into the growing cartographic record. The production of these charts became a significant industry in the major maritime cities. Families of chart makers passed down their skills through generations. The Genoese Vescont family produced charts in the early 14th century. In Majorca, Jewish chart makers created some of the most beautiful and elaborate examples, combining accurate nautical information with decorative elements showing ships, sea monsters, and the flags of various kingdoms. These charts were not merely functional tools, but also objects of considerable value and artistry. What makes Portolan charts particularly significant in the long history of cartography is how they represented a different way of knowing the world. While contemporary medieval maps placed Jerusalem at the center and organized geography according to religious meaning, Portolan charts were fundamentally empirical. They showed what sailors had actually observed. They included no theoretical lands, no symbolic arrangements, no attempt to represent paradise or biblical geography. A coast appeared on a Portolan chart only if someone had sailed along it and recorded what they had seen. This practical, observational approach would prove enormously influential. When European exploration pushed beyond the Mediterranean into the wider Atlantic, the Portolan chart tradition provided a template for representing new discoveries. The techniques for drawing accurate coastlines from sailors' reports, the methods for showing compass bearings, the entire approach of building maps from accumulated direct observations, all of these would be carried forward into the great age of oceanic exploration. As night falls over the quiet Mediterranean harbors where these charts first took shape, we can imagine the lamplight in a chartmaker's workshop, the careful hand adding one more coastal town to the growing web of knowledge. Each line drawn was a connection between places, a path that sailors had followed and would follow again. The Portolan charts transformed the sea from an unknown expanse into a known space, a place where human knowledge could provide guidance and where experience could be preserved and shared across generations of those who made their lives upon the water. The Mediterranean sailors had proven that maps could be practical tools, drawn from direct observation and hard-won experience. Their Portolan charts showed coastlines with remarkable accuracy, guiding ships safely from port to port across familiar waters. But as the 14th century gave way to the 15th, a new restlessness stirred in the kingdoms along Europe's Atlantic edge. The known world was beginning to feel small, and beyond the Pillars of Hercules lay an ocean that beckoned with both promise and menace. Portugal, perched on the westernmost edge of Europe, became the unlikely center of this new age of maritime ambition. Prince Henry, often remembered as the navigator, established himself at Sagres near Cape St. Vincent, where the land ended and the Atlantic began. He gathered around him pilots, cartographers, mathematicians, and sea captains, creating something between a school and a workshop. Henry himself was not an explorer in the traditional sense, rarely venturing far from shore, but he understood that knowledge could be systematically pursued, that each voyage could add another piece to an expanding puzzle. The challenge facing these Portuguese mariners was fundamentally different from anything Mediterranean sailors had encountered. The coastline of Africa curved away southward into unknown waters, and no Portolan chart could help them there. Ancient authorities offered only speculation and legend. Ptolemy's maps showed Africa extending eastward indefinitely, perhaps joining with Asia to make the Indian Ocean a landlocked sea. Other sources hinted that the southern regions were too hot for human habitation, that the sea itself might boil under the equatorial sun. Each expedition had to become its own mapping project. Ships would venture southward along the African coast, their crews noting landmarks, measuring distances, observing the depth and color of the water, watching how the stars shifted position as they sailed. They would return with reports of rivers and capes, of islands glimpsed through morning mist, of anchorages where fresh water could be found. These observations were carefully recorded, compared, and gradually transferred onto charts that grew longer year by year. The process was painstakingly slow. Cape Bojador, jutting into the Atlantic from the Saharan coast, took 15 expeditions and 12 years to pass. Sailors feared the strong currents and shoals, but more than that, they feared the unknown. What lay beyond? Would they be able to return? The winds and currents that carried them south seemed reluctant to carry them north again. It took both courage and careful observation of wind patterns to discover that sailing westward into the open ocean allowed ships to catch winds that would carry them home. As Portuguese ships ventured further south through the 1440s and 1450s, mapmakers faced new challenges. The coastline they were charting ran north to south, rather than east to west, stretching their parchments in unfamiliar ways. They had to find methods to represent not just position, but also the prevailing winds, the ocean currents, the seasonal patterns that governed these waters. A map of the Atlantic coast of Africa needed to be more than just an outline. It needed to encode the knowledge that made safe return possible. The discovery of the Atlantic islands brought both confirmation and confusion. Sailors had known about the Canary Islands since ancient times, but now Portuguese expeditions found Madeira, the Azores, and the Cape Verde Islands. Each discovery required cartographers to reconsider the relationship between land and water in the Atlantic. These islands became crucial waypoints, places where ships could resupply and repair, reference points for navigation. Their positions had to be determined with care, for an error of even a few degrees could send a ship searching empty ocean. By the time Bartolomeu Dias reached the southern tip of Africa in 1488, Portuguese maps had been transformed. What had been a vague coastline sketched from ancient hearsay had become a detailed survey based on decades of direct observation. The Cape of Good Hope appeared on maps in approximately its correct position, some 6,000 miles south of Lisbon. Africa was revealed to be a peninsula, not an endless barrier, and beyond it lay the route to the Indian Ocean. But these maps were valuable secrets, closely guarded by the Portuguese crown. In the archives of Lisbon, master charts were carefully maintained and updated, but their details were not shared freely with other nations. Knowledge of wind patterns, safe anchorages, and navigation routes represented commercial and strategic advantage. The Portuguese had invested decades and countless lives in acquiring this information. They had no intention of simply giving it away. The Spanish kingdoms, newly unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, watched Portuguese expansion with growing interest. If Africa could be circumnavigated, if new routes to distant lands could be found, then Spanish ships might pursue their own paths to wealth and discovery. The competition between these two Atlantic powers would drive exploration forward at an accelerating pace, each voyage adding new details to maps that were becoming windows onto an expanding world. The maps created during this period show us the hesitant beginnings of a transformation. Coastlines that had been mere suggestions became firm lines. Blank spaces began to fill with place names, though the interiors of continents remained mysterious. The mapmakers of the late 15th century worked with one foot in the medieval world and one in something new. They still decorated their charts with religious imagery and classical references, but increasingly they relied on measured observation rather than ancient authority. These maps were tools of empire as much as navigation. They represented claims and ambitions, marking out spheres of influence even in waters that European ships had barely entered. Yet they were also genuine attempts to understand and represent a world that was revealing itself to be far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. The blank spaces on these maps were invitations and challenges, reminding viewers of how much remained unknown. As the 15th century drew to a close, the maps that guided Portuguese and Spanish sailors were unlike anything that had existed before. They showed not just coastlines, but ocean routes tested by experience. They incorporated practical knowledge about winds and currents, seasonal patterns, and safe harbors. They were documents of discovery, recording the gradual pushing back of the boundary between the known and the unknown. And they were about to be tested by voyages that would challenge every assumption about the world's geography and force cartographers to reimagine the very shape of the Earth. The Portuguese ships had traced the coast of Africa, returning with tales of Guinea and the Cape. Spanish vessels had ventured into the Atlantic, discovering islands that seemed to drift in the ocean like stepping stones to somewhere greater. And in Genoa, a weaver's son with red hair and extraordinary confidence was studying maps that would lead him to miscalculate the world's dimensions in the most consequential way imaginable. Christopher Columbus pored over every scrap of geographical knowledge he could find. He studied Ptolemy's ancient calculations, though he seemed to favor the estimates that suited his purposes. He read Marco Polo's descriptions of Cathay and Cipangu, letting his imagination transform those distant lands into destinations just beyond the horizon. He examined Pierre Daly's Imago Mundi, a geographical compendium that conveniently suggested Asia extended much farther east than it actually did. Each source became a thread in the tapestry of conviction he was weaving. The maps available to Columbus in the 1480s represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, confusion, and wishful thinking. The world as depicted on these parchments was simultaneously too large and too small. Too large because medieval cartographers had stretched Asia across far more degrees of longitude than it actually occupied. Too small because Columbus preferred Ptolemy's underestimate of Earth's circumference to the more accurate ancient calculation by Eratosthenes. When you combined an Earth smaller than reality with an Asia wider than truth, the ocean between Europe and the Orient shrank to a distance that seemed almost manageable. Columbus proposed sailing west to reach the east, and his calculations suggested the journey would cover perhaps 3,000 miles. In this, he was profoundly mistaken. The actual distance to Asia, traveling westward from the Canary Islands, exceeded 12,000 miles. Had the American continents not existed precisely where they did, Columbus and his crews would have perished at sea, their supplies exhausted long before any land appeared. His error in judgment was dramatic, but the placement of an unexpected obstacle would transform his mistake into one of history's most famous voyages. The maps Columbus carried or consulted included works by Florentine mathematician Paolo Toscanelli, who had corresponded with the explorer and shared his optimistic assessment of the westward route's feasibility. Toscanelli's map, now lost to us, apparently showed a narrow ocean with various islands breaking up the journey. These phantom islands, some drawn from genuine Atlantic discoveries like the Azores and Madeira, others from legend and imagination, dotted the ocean sea and made the prospect less daunting. When Columbus finally secured Spanish sponsorship and sailed in 1492, he carried not just ships and supplies, but a collection of geographical assumptions that were about to collide with reality. His navigation skills were excellent. He could read winds and currents with practiced expertise. But the world he expected to find existed only on his maps and in his certainty. The islands he encountered in the Caribbean seemed to him exactly what his maps had predicted: the outer reaches of Asia, the islands Marco Polo had described, the eastern edge of the Indies. Columbus named the Taino people he encountered Indians because he believed absolutely that he had reached the Indian Ocean region. He searched the Caribbean islands for the palaces of the Great Khan, for the gold-roofed temples Marco Polo had described, for some recognizable feature from the travelers' accounts he had memorized. Reality refused to match the maps. The people spoke no language related to Asian tongues. The architecture bore no resemblance to Chinese or Japanese designs. The flora and fauna were strange and unprecedented. Yet Columbus maintained his interpretation, adjusting his understanding to preserve his fundamental belief about where he was. Perhaps he had reached outlying islands. Perhaps these were regions Marco Polo had not described in detail. The power of expectation, of maps internalized and believed, was strong enough to reshape perception itself. Back in Europe, cartographers faced an extraordinary puzzle. Columbus insisted he had reached Asia. He returned with gold, with unusual plants, with people who clearly came from somewhere previously unknown to Europeans. How should these discoveries appear on maps? The existing framework of world geography had no obvious place for them. Early maps following Columbus's voyages show this confusion beautifully. Some cartographers drew the new islands near Asia, accepting Columbus's interpretation. Others positioned them ambiguously, avoiding commitment to a specific geographical relationship. The world map was being redrawn, but the artists wielding the pens were unsure what picture was emerging. Juan de la Cosa, who had sailed with Columbus, created a world map around 1500 that showed the new discoveries as a substantial landmass separate from Asia, though the relationship remained unclear. This map, drawn on oxhide and colored with beautiful pigments, represented an honest attempt to incorporate contradictory information. The Caribbean islands appeared along what seemed to be a continuous coast, but how far that coast extended and whether it was an island barrier or a continental mass remained mysterious. Meanwhile, Amerigo Vespucci sailed along the coast of South America and began proposing something radical. These lands, he suggested, were not Asia at all. They represented a new world, a continent unknown to ancient geographers, missing from Ptolemy's maps, absent from all the classical sources. This interpretation began to gain acceptance among cartographers, even as Columbus himself insisted to his dying day that he had reached the Indies. The Waldseemüller map of 1507 took the revolutionary step of labeling these new southern lands, America, after Amerigo Vespucci, and of showing them as entirely separate from Asia. This map depicted two vast oceans, the Atlantic already sailed by Europeans, and beyond the American continents, a second great ocean only vaguely suspected. The world was suddenly, dramatically larger than Columbus had believed. The maps he had trusted had led him to lands they did not describe, and now the entire framework of world geography required reconstruction. Columbus's geographical misconceptions had resulted in perhaps the most productive mistake in the history of exploration. His miscalculations had been dramatic enough that a different ocean would almost certainly have proved fatal. But where he expected to find Cathay, he found Caribbean islands. Where he expected Marco Polo's Sipangu, he encountered a hemisphere that would take centuries to fully map and understand. The cartographers who struggled to represent these discoveries were documenting not just new coastlines, but the collision between expectation and reality, between ancient authority and modern discovery. Their maps became visual records of understanding gradually adjusting to evidence, of worldviews slowly, reluctantly transforming. The blank spaces Columbus had believed to be narrow ocean had proven to contain entire continents, and the mapmakers now faced the enormous task of filling in those spaces with accuracy rather than assumption. The journey that would forever change humanity's understanding of Earth's true dimensions began not with grand certainty, but with a desperate gamble. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator who had fallen out of favor with his own king, found a more receptive audience in Spain. He arrived at the Spanish court with promises that echoed those of Columbus, but with a crucial difference. Where Columbus had sought to reach Asia by sailing west, Magellan proposed something far more audacious. He would find a passage through or around the newly discovered American landmass and reach the Spice Islands by continuing westward all the way around the globe. In September of 1519, 5 ships departed from Spain carrying about 270 men. The vessels were small, weathered, and according to some accounts, barely seaworthy. Yet they carried with them the potential to answer questions that had puzzled mapmakers since ancient times. How large was the Earth really? What lay in the vast unknown regions that existed as blank spaces on even the most ambitious world maps? And perhaps most pressingly for the Spanish crown, was there truly a western route to the lucrative spice trade that Portugal currently dominated? The expedition's first year followed a now familiar path down the Atlantic coast of South America. But as the ships moved southward along the continent's eastern shore, they were charting waters that few Europeans had explored. Magellan searched every inlet, every promising bay, hoping to find the passage that would lead through to the other side. Winter in the southern hemisphere forced them to anchor in a bleak harbor, where cold winds howled and supplies dwindled. Mutiny threatened the expedition before the passage was even found. When spring returned to those southern latitudes, Magellan resumed his search. In October of 1520, more than a year after leaving Spain, the expedition finally discovered what they sought. A narrow, twisting channel cut through the southern tip of the continent, a waterway so convoluted and dangerous that it would bear Magellan's name forever after. The Strait of Magellan was not the simple passage they had hoped for. It wound through mountainous terrain, splitting into confusing branches and dead ends. The journey through took 38 days of careful navigation through unpredictable currents and fierce winds. One ship turned back, its crew deciding that the risks ahead outweighed any potential rewards. They carried with them detailed charts of the passage they had discovered, ensuring that even if the rest of the expedition failed, this geographic knowledge would return to Europe. The remaining ships emerged from the western end of the strait into an ocean that stretched before them with deceptive calm. Magellan named it the Pacific, the peaceful sea, based on the fortunate weather that greeted them. It was a name that would persist, though sailors in later years would discover that this ocean could be anything but peaceful. What neither Magellan nor his crew could have imagined was the true scale of what lay ahead. The maps they carried, based on Ptolemy's calculations and Columbus's assumptions, suggested that Asia lay a relatively short distance across this ocean. The reality was staggeringly different. Day after day, week after week, the ships sailed westward across empty ocean. The gentle winds that had initially seemed like good fortune became monotonous. The horizon remained featureless in every direction. As weeks turned to months, the situation aboard the ships grew desperate. Supplies of fresh food ran out first, then water became rationed, then even the preserved foods began to spoil or run low. The crews, accustomed to the relatively short ocean crossings of the Atlantic, found themselves in a maritime desert unlike anything in their experience. They were crossing not just an ocean, but a significant portion of Earth's entire surface, and their maps had given them no warning of the distance involved. The Pacific Ocean, they were discovering through bitter experience, covered nearly a third of the planet's surface. It was larger than all the land masses of Earth combined. The distance they traveled, mostly without sight of land, exceeded 10,000 miles. Small islands appeared occasionally, like mirages in an ocean wilderness, but many offered little in the way of supplies. The expedition passed between island groups, sometimes without even seeing them, simply because the ocean was so vast and the islands so small in comparison. When they finally reached Guam in March of 1521, nearly 4 months after entering the Pacific, the ships and their crews were barely functional. The discovery of this crossing's true scale was perhaps the expedition's greatest contribution to cartography. Mapmakers back in Europe, receiving reports of this journey, would have to completely reconceive their understanding of Earth's geography. The world was not only round, as educated people already knew, but it was far larger than most calculations had suggested, and the distribution of land and water across its surface was radically different from what maps had shown. Magellan himself would not complete the journey. He became entangled in local conflicts in the Philippines and lost his life there in April of 1521. The expedition continued under new leadership, now reduced to 3 ships. They reached the Spice Islands, the Moluccas, finally achieving the commercial goal that had justified the entire venture. Here they loaded valuable cargo of cloves and other spices, before beginning the return journey. The route home presented a new challenge. Sailing back eastward across the Pacific was impossible given the prevailing winds and their depleted state. Instead, they chose to continue westward, attempting to complete the circumnavigation. 2 ships were lost in various misadventures, their crews scattered across the islands of Southeast Asia. Only one vessel, the Victoria, under the command of Juan Sebastián Elcano, successfully crossed the Indian Ocean, rounded Africa's Cape of Good Hope, and made the long journey up the Atlantic to Spain. When the Victoria finally limped into a Spanish harbor in September of 1522, only 18 of the original crew remained aboard. They had been gone for 3 years. They had lost 4 ships and most of their companions. But they had accomplished something unprecedented in human history. They had traveled entirely around the world by heading continuously westward. They had proven beyond any doubt that Earth was a sphere, and they had measured its dimensions through direct experience rather than mathematical calculation. The maps in the possession of the survivors, annotated with their observations and discoveries, would transform European cartography. The Pacific Ocean would finally appear on world maps at something approaching its true scale. The Strait of Magellan would be charted, offering a route between the Atlantic and Pacific that other navigators could follow. The relative positions of the continents and the vast distances between them would need to be redrawn. As you drift towards sleep, imagine those 18 survivors bringing their precious knowledge home, carrying in their minds and journals a completely new understanding of the world's shape and size, ready to redraw every map and chart, ready to fill in those blank spaces with hard-won truth about the real dimensions of our extraordinary planet. The world had been circumnavigated, its true dimensions revealed, yet sailors still faced a persistent problem each time they set out across the open ocean. They knew where they were leaving from, and they had a reasonably clear idea of where they wished to arrive, but the path between these 2 points remained treacherously difficult to plot. A ship could not simply aim its bow toward a destination and sail in a straight line, for the spherical nature of Earth meant that such intuitive navigation led vessels astray. The art of sailing required constant adjustment of course, a wearisome recalculation of angles and bearings that taxed even experienced navigators. Into this world of maritime frustration stepped Gerardus Mercator, a Flemish geographer and cartographer whose mind worked with mathematical precision. Born in 1512 in the town of Rupelmonde, he had been christened Gerard de Crema, but following the scholarly fashion of his age, he Latinized his surname to Mercator, which means merchant or trader. Perhaps this name carried a certain destiny, for his greatest creation would become the most traded, copied, and utilized map projection in maritime history. Mercator had already established himself as a skilled maker of globes and maps by the time he began contemplating the navigator's dilemma. He understood that every attempt to represent the curved surface of a sphere on a flat piece of paper required compromise. Something had to give. Earlier mapmakers had chosen various compromises, preserving accurate shapes here while sacrificing correct distances there, maintaining proper directions in one region while accepting distortions in another. Each projection reflected a different set of priorities, a different answer to the fundamental question of what mattered most. What Mercator recognized, with the clarity that marks true innovation, was that sailors needed above all else to be able to draw a straight line between 2 points on a map and know that this line represented a constant compass bearing. Imagine the simplicity of this. A navigator could use a straight edge to connect departure and destination, measure the angle this line made with north, and then maintain that bearing throughout the voyage. No complex calculations needed. No continuous course corrections based on changing angles. Just one bearing held steady across leagues of open water. The challenge was formidable. Lines of constant bearing, which sailors called rum lines or loxodromes, actually trace spiral paths on a globe. They are not the shortest routes between points, but they are the easiest to follow, requiring only that a ship maintain a fixed compass heading. Mercator needed to devise a way of projecting the spherical Earth onto a flat surface, such that these spiraling paths would appear as straight lines. His solution, published in 1569 on a world map comprising 18 separate sheets that together measured nearly 7 feet tall and 10 feet wide, was ingenious. Imagine a transparent globe with the continents painted on its surface, and inside this globe, a paper cylinder touching the equator all the way around. Now imagine a light at the very center of the globe, projecting the continents outward onto the cylinder. Finally, imagine that this projection has been cleverly modified, stretched in a specific mathematical way as you move toward the poles. When you unwrap the cylinder and lay it flat, you have a Mercator projection. The technical innovation lay in how Mercator progressively increased the spacing between latitude lines as they approached the poles. Near the equator, the parallels of latitude remained close together, much as they appear on a globe. But moving northward or southward, Mercator gradually stretched the spacing, expanding it according to a precise mathematical formula. This expansion exactly compensated for the east-west stretching that occurred in any cylindrical projection, preserving angles and shapes at every point on the map. The result was transformative. On Mercator's projection, any straight line drawn on the map crossed all meridians of longitude at the same angle, representing a constant compass bearing. A sailor could plot a course with unprecedented ease. The map became a practical tool for navigation in a way that earlier world maps simply could not match. Yet this innovation came at a cost, and it was a cost that would echo through centuries. As the latitude lines spread farther apart approaching the poles, the landmasses in those regions appeared increasingly larger than they actually were. Greenland, on a Mercator projection, appears similar in size to Africa, though in reality Africa is more than 14 times larger. Antarctica stretches across the bottom of the map as an impossibly elongated white expanse. The poles themselves cannot be shown at all, for they would require infinite distance on the map. Mercator was well aware of these distortions. His projection was designed for navigation, not for comparing the true sizes of continents or understanding global geography in a comprehensive way. But the map proved so extraordinarily useful for sailors that it spread rapidly throughout the maritime world. Ship after ship carried charts based on Mercator's innovation. The projection appeared in atlas after atlas, becoming the standard reference for world maps. Mercator himself continued working after this triumph, pursuing an ambitious project to create a comprehensive atlas of the world. The word atlas, in its cartographic sense, actually originates with Mercator, who chose this title for his collection of maps, invoking the mythological Titan condemned to hold up the celestial spheres. The first parts of Mercator's atlas appeared in 1585 and 1589, with the complete work published by his son Romuald in 1595, a year after Gerardus died. The influence of Mercator's projection extended far beyond the 16th century. As European powers expanded their maritime reach, as trade routes crisscrossed oceans, as navies patrolled distant waters, the Mercator projection went with them. It became so ubiquitous that for many people, this distorted view of Earth's geography came to define their mental image of the world. Schoolroom walls displayed Mercator projections. Reference atlases opened to Mercator world maps. The projection that had been designed as a specialized tool for navigation became, almost by accident, the default representation of our planet. This dominance would eventually spark debate and criticism, particularly in the 20th century, as scholars pointed out how the projection's distortions affected perceptions of different regions, making northern lands appear disproportionately prominent. But in Mercator's own time, and for centuries after, his innovation represented a triumph of applied mathematics, a solution to a real problem that had hindered sailors since the first ship ventured beyond sight of land. As ships carried Mercator's maps across the oceans, they also carried the means to explore and chart regions still blank on those maps, ready to fill the remaining unknown spaces with the hard-won knowledge of countless voyages yet to come. The great projection that Mercator gave to the world made sailing routes clearer, but the maps themselves still contained vast empty spaces, particularly across the Americas. While coastlines had been traced with increasing accuracy by the late 16th century, the interiors of North and South America remained largely blank on European maps, decorated only with speculative illustrations of mountains, forests, and sometimes imaginary creatures. These blank spaces represented both an invitation and a challenge to those who sought to understand the full extent of these continents. The process of filling these empty spaces would take centuries and would involve a remarkable combination of sources. Spanish conquistadors pushing inland from coastal settlements sent back reports of silver-rich mountains in Peru and vast river systems that seemed to flow endlessly through equatorial forests. Jesuit missionaries traveling among indigenous peoples documented their journeys with careful notes about distances, river confluences, and the locations of settlements. French fur traders paddling through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi compiled their own mental maps of waterways and portages. Each of these fragments of knowledge slowly found its way back to European cartographers who faced the formidable task of piecing together these accounts into coherent maps. The early maps of America's interior reveal the difficulty of this compilation. Rivers might appear twice under different names, or mountain ranges might be placed hundreds of miles from their actual locations. A lake described by one traveler might be merged with a different lake mentioned by another, creating phantom bodies of water that would persist on maps for decades. Yet gradually, through the accumulation of many observations, patterns emerged and the landscape began to take recognizable shape on paper. In South America, the Spanish quickly established the general outline of the Andes Mountains, that tremendous spine running the length of the continent's western edge. The silver mines of Potosi, discovered in 1545, ensured that this region received particular cartographic attention. Spanish administrators needed accurate maps to govern their territories, to plan supply routes, and to assess the resources under their control. The great cities of the interior, Quito, Lima, and Cusco, appeared on maps with reasonable accuracy relatively early, connected by the network of roads that had once served the Inca Empire. The Amazon basin presented a different challenge entirely. This vast region of rivers and rainforest defied easy mapping. The first European to navigate the length of the Amazon, Francisco de Orellana, completed his journey in 1542, but his expedition provided only a single thread through an immensely complex web of waterways. Portuguese explorers pushing westward from Brazil's Atlantic coast added their own pieces to the puzzle, while Spanish missionaries entering from Peru contributed additional details. The resulting maps showed the Amazon's general course, but the countless tributaries, the seasonal flooding, and the sheer scale of the forest meant that accurate mapping would remain incomplete for centuries. In North America, the great river systems became the highways of exploration and the organizing features of early maps. The St. Lawrence River gave access to the interior, leading French explorers to the Great Lakes, those inland seas that seemed almost impossibly large to Europeans familiar with smaller bodies of water. In 1673, Louis Joliet and Father Jacques Marquette paddled down the Mississippi, discovering that it flowed not westward to the Pacific, as some had hoped, but southward to the Gulf of Mexico. This single journey dramatically changed the shape of North America on European maps. The maps that resulted from these explorations often combined information from indigenous peoples with European observations. Native Americans had traveled these lands for thousands of years and possessed detailed knowledge of routes, distances, and geographic relationships. Explorers frequently relied on guides and on maps drawn by indigenous informants. These native maps might be sketched in sand, drawn on bark, or described verbally, and they often emphasized practical information about travel times and portages rather than the geometric precision Europeans sought. When transferred to European-style maps, this indigenous knowledge proved invaluable, even as it was translated into a different cartographic language. The Spanish, in particular, developed a systematic approach to gathering geographic information from their territories. They distributed questionnaires to colonial administrators asking detailed questions about local geography, resources, and indigenous populations. The responses, accompanied sometimes by locally drawn maps, flowed back to the Council of the Indies in Seville, where they were compiled into ever more detailed representations of New Spain. These maps served administrative purposes, but also reflected an imperial desire to know and control distant territories through the power of representation. By the 17th century, the general shape of the Americas was well established, but enormous gaps remained. The interior of North America west of the Mississippi appeared on maps as vaguely drawn speculation. The Amazon's countless tributaries remained largely unknown. The southern tip of South America, where the continent fractured into a maze of islands and channels, continued to puzzle cartographers. And the Pacific coast of North America, north of Mexico, remained so poorly understood that some maps still showed California as an island, a persistent cartographic error that took decades to fully correct. The artistic conventions of these maps reveal the mixture of knowledge and ignorance. Where information was reliable, cartographers drew with confidence, showing rivers, settlements, and routes with fine lines and careful labels. Where knowledge faded into uncertainty, the maps became more decorative. Mountains might be shown as stylized peaks marching across the page in neat rows. Forests appeared as clusters of identical trees. The blank spaces themselves were often filled with illustrations, elaborate cartouches, compass roses, and text, as if the cartographer sought to distract the eye from the absence of geographic detail. Despite their limitations, these maps of the Americas' interiors served crucial purposes. They guided subsequent expeditions, helped plan colonial settlements, and provided a framework for imagining these vast territories. Each new expedition added details, corrected errors, and pushed back the boundaries of the unknown. The blank spaces grew smaller year by year, though they never quite disappeared completely, for even today there remain remote regions where the land holds secrets from easy observation. As the 18th century approached, the great task of mapping the Americas' interiors continued with increasing sophistication. Better instruments, more systematic surveys, and the accumulation of countless individual observations slowly transformed speculation into knowledge. and the maps began to reflect the true complexity and grandeur of these continents, even as other blank spaces on the globe, particularly in the southern oceans, still beckon to explorers with their mysterious promise. As the great maps of the Americas began to take recognizable shape, cartographers turned their attention southward, toward the bottom of the world, where vast expanses of ocean stretched into mystery. For centuries, mapmakers had suspected that somewhere in those southern waters lay a great continent, a massive landmass that would balance the weight of the northern lands and complete the symmetry of the globe. The ancient Greeks had theorized about this southern continent, calling it Terra Australis incognita, the unknown southern land. Their logic seemed sound enough. The world, they reasoned, needed balance. With so much land in the northern hemisphere, surely there must be equally substantial land in the south to prevent the Earth from toppling. This idea persisted through the medieval period and into the age of exploration, appearing on map after map as a vast, speculative landmass curving across the bottom of the world. On these early maps, Terra Australis appeared enormous, often stretching from beneath South America across to Africa, a continent larger than all the known lands combined. Cartographers decorated these imaginary shores with mountains and rivers, cities and kingdoms, all conjured from hope and theory rather than observation. The blank spaces at the edge of the world called out to be filled, and imagination answered where knowledge remained silent. The Portuguese and Spanish navigators who ventured into the Pacific in the 16th century caught tantalizing glimpses that seemed to confirm these theories. In 1506, a Spanish expedition may have sighted the northern coast of New Guinea, though accounts remain unclear. Subsequent voyages found islands scattered across the vast ocean, each discovery raising the question of whether this might be the edge of the great southern continent. Dutch navigators, venturing from their trading posts in the East Indies, began to encounter an unexpected coastline. In 1606, Willem Janszoon made landfall on the western coast of Cape York Peninsula, becoming likely the first European to set foot on what would later be called Australia, though he believed it to be an extension of New Guinea. Over the following decades, Dutch ships sailing the trade routes encountered more sections of this coast, gradually revealing a substantial landmass. These encounters were often accidental, the result of ships being blown off course or exploring too far while searching for trade opportunities. The Dutch Captain Dirk Hartog landed on an island off the western coast in 1616, leaving behind a pewter plate to mark his visit. Other Dutch navigators mapped additional sections of the western and southern coasts, but what they found disappointed those seeking the rich southern continent of legend. The coasts appeared barren and forbidding, the land seemingly offering little of value. Abel Tasman, sailing for the Dutch East India Company in 1642, circumnavigated what was then called New Holland without actually sighting its eastern coast. He discovered the island now called Tasmania and continued east to sight the western coast of New Zealand. His voyage proved that New Holland was not connected to any massive polar continent extending toward South America, yet the question remained unanswered. Could this be the fabled Terra Australis, or was the great southern continent still waiting to be found farther south? Maps of the period reflected this uncertainty. Some cartographers drew New Holland as a known quantity, with its western and northern coasts taking definite shape, while its eastern extent remained vague. Others continued to show an enormous Terra Australis stretching away to the south, with New Holland perhaps forming its northern peninsula. The bottom of the world remained a puzzle with too many missing pieces. For more than a century after Tasman, the Pacific held its secrets. European powers focused their attention on more immediately profitable ventures, and the remote Southern Ocean remained largely unvisited by explorers with the skills and resources to conduct proper surveys. Then came James Cook, a master navigator and meticulous chartmaker whose 3 Pacific voyages would finally resolve the ancient question. In 1769, Cook sailed the Endeavour to Tahiti to observe the transit of Venus, then opened sealed orders directing him to search for the southern continent. He sailed south, then west, becoming the first European to thoroughly chart New Zealand's coastline and proving it to be 2 separate islands rather than part of any continent. Continuing west, Cook encountered the eastern coast of New Holland, the shoreline no European had yet mapped. He followed it northward, charting with careful precision before threading through the dangerous passage between Australia and New Guinea. Where Dutch navigators had found mostly barren coasts, Cook discovered the fertile eastern shores, though this land was still far smaller than the legendary Terra Australis. Cook's second voyage, from 1772 to 1775, specifically targeted the question of the southern continent. He sailed into the Antarctic waters, crossing the Antarctic Circle multiple times and venturing farther south than any ship had gone before. The conditions tested every limit of wooden ships and human endurance, with ice surrounding them and cold penetrating everything. Cook circumnavigated the Antarctic region, proving definitively that if any land existed at the pole, it lay within an ice-locked zone that made it inaccessible and essentially irrelevant to the theories that had driven the search. The great Terra Australis of imagination vanished from maps, replaced by knowledge of what actually existed. Australia emerged in its true proportions, a substantial island continent, but not the vast, balancing landmass of ancient theory. The Southern Ocean spread wide and mostly empty, dotted with small islands. Antarctica itself would not be definitively sighted until the 1820s, when Russian, British, and American expeditions separately reported seeing the ice-covered land. Even then, it would take decades more to establish that this was indeed a continent rather than a collection of ice-covered islands, and its interior would remain blank on maps well into the 20th century. The search for Terra Australis represented something essential about the evolution of cartography. Maps had begun as documents of theory and belief, with speculation filling the spaces beyond direct knowledge. Through persistent exploration and careful observation, the blank spaces were filled not with what people hoped to find, but with what actually existed. The imagined gave way to the real, and maps became more accurate even as they sometimes became less wondrous. The world revealed itself to be different from ancient theories, but no less remarkable for its actual configuration. The age of speculative continents ended, and the age of systematic, scientific survey began to take its place. As explorers returned from distant shores with tales of what they had seen, and as the great southern lands finally revealed their true shapes upon the maps of the world, a quiet revolution was taking place closer to home. The mapmakers of Europe were becoming dissatisfied with approximation and estimation. The age of speculation was giving way to the age of measurement, and the tools of mathematics were about to transform cartography from an art of educated guessing into a precise science. The problem had always been one of certainty. How could you know, with absolute confidence, the distance between two cities? How could you be sure that the coastline drawn on your map was positioned exactly where it belonged in relation to everything else? Ancient mapmakers had relied on travelers' reports, on estimates of journey times, on rough compass bearings. The results, while useful, were never quite accurate. Mountains appeared in the wrong places, Rivers followed impossible courses. The shape of a kingdom, on paper, rarely matched its true form on the land. In the 17th century, a solution emerged from the geometric principles that had been known since antiquity, but never applied so systematically to the task of mapping. The technique was called triangulation, and it would allow surveyors to measure the world with unprecedented precision. The concept itself was elegantly simple. If you knew the length of one side of a triangle and you could measure the angles at each corner, you could calculate the lengths of the other two sides. This was basic trigonometry taught in universities throughout Europe, but applying this principle to the landscape required imagination and persistence. Picture a surveyor standing atop a hill in the French countryside on a clear morning. He can see, in the distance, two church steeples. Using a theodolite, an instrument fitted with telescopic sights and precisely graduated circles, he measures the angle between those two distant points. Then he travels to one of those church steeples and measures the angles to the hill he just left and to the other church. From these observations, and from one carefully measured baseline on the ground, he can calculate the exact distances between all 3 points. Each triangle becomes the foundation for the next. The second church steeple and another distant landmark form a new triangle, which leads to another and another, creating a network of triangles spreading across the land. This was the method that would map nations. The first great application came in France, where the Cassini family would devote 4 generations to surveying their country with geometric precision. Jean-Dominique Cassini, already famous as an astronomer, began the project in 1669 at the request of King Louis XIV. The work would continue through his son, grandson, and great-grandson, spanning more than a century. The Cassinis started by measuring a baseline with extraordinary care. On the plain near Paris, they laid out a distance of several miles, measuring it not once but many times, using wooden rods that had to be carefully aligned and whose lengths had to be corrected for temperature, since wood expands and contracts with heat and cold. This single line, measured more accurately than any distance had been measured before, would serve as the foundation for all the triangles to follow. From this baseline, the surveyors established a network of triangulation stations across France. They built towers, climbed mountains, and cleared sight lines through forests. Each observation had to be made with meticulous care. The theodolite had to be perfectly level. The distant target had to be clearly visible, which meant working on clear days and sometimes waiting weeks for suitable weather. At night, they sometimes used lanterns or even bonfires to mark distant stations. The work was slow and demanding. A team might spend an entire season establishing just a few dozen triangulation points, but the results were transformative. As the network grew, the true shape of France emerged with a clarity that had never before been possible. When the early results were presented to King Louis XIV, he is said to have complained that the surveyors had cost him more territory than he had lost in war. For the new, accurate maps showed France to be smaller than the older, more generous estimates had suggested. The French surveys inspired similar efforts across Europe. In Britain, the Ordnance Survey began its work in the late 18th century, initially driven by military concerns. Accurate maps were essential for defending the realm, particularly after the Jacobite uprisings had demonstrated how poorly the government understood the geography of Scotland. The surveyors of the Ordnance Survey would eventually create maps of extraordinary detail, showing not just the positions of towns and roads, but the contours of the land itself. Perhaps the most ambitious triangulation project was undertaken in India, where the Great Trigonometrical Survey set out to map the vast subcontinent with scientific precision. Beginning in 1802, British surveyors working under the leadership of William Lambton and later George Everest extended a network of triangulation stations from the southern tip of India northward toward the Himalayas. The challenges in India were immense. The distances were vast. The climate could be harsh, with monsoons halting work for months at a time. In the forested regions, surveyors had to build tall towers to see over the trees. In the mountains, they worked at altitudes where breathing became difficult and where storms could arrive with little warning. Yet they persisted, measuring and calculating, extending their network of triangles year after year. It was during this survey that the world's highest peak was identified and measured. From stations more than 100 miles away, surveyors observed a distant summit in the Himalayas and, through their triangulation calculations, determined its height. The mountain, known locally by various names, would be designated as Peak XV in the survey records and later named Mount Everest in honor of George Everest, though he himself had retired by the time the mountain was measured and had never seen it with his own eyes. The development of triangulation did more than create accurate maps. It allowed nations to be measured in ways that had never before been possible. Exact areas could be calculated, precise boundaries could be established. The science of geodesy emerged, concerned not just with mapping the surface of the Earth, but with understanding its true shape, which turned out to be not quite a perfect sphere, but slightly flattened at the poles. As the 19th century progressed, the principles of triangulation spread across the globe. Surveyors climbed mountains, crossed deserts, and penetrated jungles, always measuring, always calculating, slowly extending the network of known points. The blank spaces on maps were filling in not with speculation or approximation, but with measurements that could be verified and trusted. The age of scientific surveying had arrived, bringing with it a new confidence in the accuracy of maps. The world was being measured, triangle by triangle, and the measurements revealed a reality more complex and wonderful than imagination alone could have drawn. By the middle of the 18th century, sailors could determine their latitude with remarkable precision. Looking to the stars, measuring the angle of the sun at noon, consulting their tables of astronomical data, a ship's navigator could tell you how far north or south of the equator they had traveled. But there remained a puzzle that had confounded mariners for centuries, a problem so vexing that it cost countless lives and ships to the depths of the ocean. The question was simple to ask, but maddeningly difficult to answer. How far east or west had they sailed? Longitude, that invisible grid of lines running from pole to pole, existed only in theory. Unlike latitude, which could be read from the fixed position of celestial bodies, longitude had no such anchor in the sky. The Earth rotates, and with it the heavens wheel overhead. A star that appears directly above you now will be hundreds of miles to the west in just a few hours. Time and distance became inextricably linked in this puzzle. If you knew the exact time at a reference point, say London or Paris, and could compare it to the local time where you stood, the difference would reveal how many degrees you had traveled around the globe. But how could a sailor, tossed on violent seas, months from any port, maintain a perfect knowledge of the time back home? The problem became so urgent that nations offered extraordinary rewards for its solution. In 1714, the British government established the Board of Longitude and promised a prize of £20,000, a fortune of almost incalculable value, to anyone who could devise a practical method of determining longitude at sea to within half a degree. Similar prizes were offered by the Spanish and Dutch. The greatest minds of the age turned their attention to this challenge. Astronomers proposed elaborate schemes involving the moons of Jupiter, whose eclipses could serve as a celestial clock visible from anywhere on Earth. Mathematicians developed the lunar distance method, which calculated longitude by measuring the precise angle between the moon and certain stars, then consulting vast tables that predicted these positions for every hour of every day. These astronomical approaches were theoretically sound, but they required calm seas, clear skies, and mathematical calculations that could take hours to complete. They were tools for the patient and the precise, but the ocean is rarely patient, and clouds often hide the stars. A clockmaker from Yorkshire named John Harrison believed the answer lay not in the heavens, but in the mechanical ingenuity of precision timekeeping. If he could build a clock that would keep perfect time despite the rolling of ships, the changes in temperature and humidity, the salt air and the months at sea, then longitude would simply be a matter of comparison. Check the local time by the sun's position, consult Harrison's clock for the time back in London, and the difference would reveal your position on the globe. It sounded straightforward, but no clock of that era could maintain such accuracy. Pendulum clocks, which kept excellent time on land, were useless at sea where the ship's motion disrupted their swing. Metal components expanded in heat and contracted in cold, throwing off the mechanism's precision. Lubricating oils thickened or evaporated. The very concept seemed to defy the limitations of 18th century technology. Harrison began his work in 1730, constructing a series of increasingly sophisticated timepieces. His first marine chronometer, known as H1, was a marvel of mechanical innovation. He used brass and steel components that expanded and contracted at different rates, balancing each other's changes to maintain consistent motion. He designed special balances and springs that compensated for temperature variations. Instead of a pendulum, he used a system of weighted beams that rocked back and forth, unaffected by the ship's movement. The device worked, but Harrison was not satisfied. He spent years building improved versions, each one smaller, more precise, more resistant to the challenges of sea travel. His fourth chronometer, H4, completed in 1759, was the size of a large pocket watch, an elegant mechanism that ticked with extraordinary accuracy. When tested on a voyage to Jamaica, it lost only 5 seconds over 81 days at sea, an achievement that seemed almost magical. Yet the board of Longitude proved reluctant to award Harrison the full prize. Some members favored the astronomical methods, perhaps finding them more intellectually impressive than a clockmaker's mechanical solution. They demanded additional tests, changed the rules, and delayed payment. Harrison, growing elderly and frustrated, spent years lobbying for recognition of his achievement. Eventually, after intervention by King George III himself, Harrison received his reward, though never quite in the manner the original prize had promised. Meanwhile, the astronomical approach continued to develop in parallel. The Astronomer Royal, Neville Maskelyne, championed the lunar distance method and published the Nautical Almanac beginning in 1767, providing the tables necessary for these calculations. The almanac gave the predicted positions of the moon relative to specific stars for every 3 hours of every day. With careful observation and calculation, a skilled navigator could determine longitude to within a degree or so, accurate enough for safe navigation in most circumstances. For decades, both methods coexisted at sea. Chronometers were expensive, delicate instruments. A ship might carry several to cross-check against each other, since a single failing timepiece could lead to disaster. The lunar distance method required no special equipment beyond a good sextant and the almanac, but it demanded mathematical skill and time. Gradually, as chronometers became more reliable and less costly to produce, they became the preferred solution. By the early 19th century, most naval and merchant vessels carried marine chronometers, their steady ticking marking not just the passage of time, but the ship's position on the face of the Earth. The solution to the longitude problem transformed cartography as profoundly as any discovery of new lands. Suddenly, mapmakers could position coastlines, islands, and harbors with unprecedented accuracy. The vague sketches that had characterized maritime charts began to sharpen into precise representations. The Pacific Ocean, which had been variously depicted as larger or smaller than reality, settled into its true, immense proportions on maps. Islands that had appeared in multiple locations on different charts, recorded by various explorers who couldn't be certain of their longitude, could now be plotted correctly, and phantom islands created by navigational errors disappeared from maps entirely. Expeditions of the late 18th and early 19th centuries carried multiple chronometers as essential equipment. Explorers could now create maps that aligned properly with reality, that allowed future travelers to retrace routes with confidence. The world became knowable in a new way, its geography fixed in space with mathematical certainty. The story of longitude reminds us that mapmaking depended not only on exploration and observation, but on solving fundamental problems of measurement and mathematics. The blank spaces on maps would continue to fill in, but now they would fill in with precision, each position verified by the steady tick of Harrison's ingenious clocks and the careful calculations of astronomers who had turned the heavens into a vast timepiece. With longitude finally conquered and the techniques of precise surveying spreading across continents, mapmakers of the early 19th century found themselves facing a curious new challenge. The question was no longer simply where things were, but what they were. The surface of the Earth, it turned out, held layers of information beyond mere position, and enterprising minds began to wonder whether maps might reveal stories hidden beneath the soil or patterns scattered across the sky. In the coal-rich counties of England, a canal surveyor named William Smith spent his days walking the countryside, examining rock exposures in canal cuts and quarry walls. Smith possessed an unusual gift for observation and an even more unusual theory. As he traveled from Somerset to Yorkshire between 1791 and 1799, he noticed something that others had missed. The same layers of rock appeared again and again in the same order, and each layer contained distinctive fossils that marked it as clearly as a signature. By the time he had surveyed enough of England, Smith realized he could predict what lay beneath the surface anywhere in the country. This insight led him to attempt something unprecedented. In 1815, after years of meticulous fieldwork and careful note-taking, Smith published a map unlike any created before. His geological map of England, Wales, and part of Scotland measured 6 feet by 8 feet and showed the country colored in subtle bands of different hues. Each color represented a different layer of rock, from the ancient coal measures in dark grays to the younger chalk formations in pale green. For the first time, a map revealed not just the surface of the land, but its hidden architecture, the bones of the Earth itself. Smith's map transformed geology from a collection of local observations into a predictive science. A mine owner could consult the map and know what minerals lay beneath a particular field. An engineer planning a tunnel could anticipate what rock types his workers would encounter. The map revealed patterns invisible to the naked eye, showing how ancient seas had once covered the land and how the forces of deep time had folded and tilted the very foundations of the landscape. The concept of thematic mapping, showing specific types of information rather than general geography, spread quickly to other fields. In 1826, a German statistician named August Friedrich Wilhelm Krohm created maps showing the distribution of crops and livestock across Europe. His agricultural maps used shading and colors to reveal patterns of cultivation, demonstrating at a glance where wheat predominated over rye or where cattle outnumbered sheep. The medical profession soon discovered the power of thematic maps to reveal hidden connections. In 1854, when cholera swept through the Soho district of London, a physician named John Snow created a simple but revolutionary map. He marked each cholera death as a small bar on a street map of the neighborhood, and the clustering of these marks around a particular water pump on Broad Street revealed the source of the outbreak. By mapping disease, Snow transformed the understanding of how cholera spread, demonstrating that it traveled through contaminated water rather than bad air. His map saved countless lives and established the foundation for epidemiology. Weather patterns, too, began to appear on maps. The telegraph had made it possible to gather simultaneous observations from distant locations, and meteorologists realized they could create snapshot views of atmospheric conditions across entire continents. In 1849, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington began collecting weather data from volunteer observers across the United States. Soon, maps decorated with symbols for wind direction, temperature, and precipitation were helping people understand the great systems of weather that marched across the land. These weather maps revealed something remarkable. Storms had structure and predictability. A low-pressure system visible on a map in Ohio one day would likely appear over Pennsylvania the next. The seemingly chaotic weather could be tracked, its movements anticipated. By the 1860s, several countries had established weather services that created daily weather maps, and the dream of weather forecasting began to seem achievable. The mid-19th century brought innovations in printing technology that made color maps more affordable and widely available. Hand coloring had always been expensive and time-consuming, but new chromolithographic techniques allowed printers to produce maps with multiple colors in a single print run. This democratization of color transformed thematic mapping from an elite pursuit into a common tool for education and planning. Population density maps appeared, showing the concentrations of people in cities versus the sparse settlements of rural areas. Economic maps displayed the flow of trade goods along rivers and railroad lines. Historical maps attempted to show how boundaries had shifted over time or where famous battles had unfolded. Each new type of thematic map revealed patterns and relationships that had previously remained hidden in tables of numbers or prose descriptions. The French engineer Charles-Joseph Maynard created what many consider the finest statistical map ever made in 1869. His map of Napoleon's disastrous 1812 invasion of Russia combined 6 types of information in a single elegant visualization. The path of the army, the number of soldiers at each point, the temperature, geographical barriers, the army's direction and dates. The thick tan band showing the Grand Army's advance into Russia gradually narrowed as soldiers died or deserted, becoming a thin black thread on the retreat from Moscow. The freezing temperatures recorded along the bottom of the map told the story of suffering without words. Maynard's map conveyed the human cost of the campaign more powerfully than any written account. As the century progressed, specialized scientific maps proliferated. Oceanographers mapped the depths of the seas, discovering underwater mountains and trenches. Botanists created maps showing the distribution of plant species, revealing patterns that hinted at ancient connections between now separated lands. Linguists mapped the boundaries of languages and dialects, showing how speech changed across space. Each new layer of thematic information added depth to humanity's understanding of the world. Maps were no longer simply tools for getting from one place to another. They had become instruments of analysis, ways of seeing patterns too large or too subtle for the unaided eye to perceive. A geologist looking at William Smith's colored bands could read Earth's history. A city planner studying population density maps could anticipate where new services would be needed. A military strategist examining terrain maps could plan campaigns. The recognition that maps could show any spatially distributed information opened endless possibilities. If something varied from place to place, it could be mapped, and mapping it often revealed unexpected patterns and relationships. The blank spaces on maps were filling in not just with coastlines and rivers, but with the invisible structures of disease, weather, wealth, language, and time itself, each layer adding new dimensions to the art and science of showing where and what things truly are. The 19th century brought with it a peculiar marriage of science and power, as the increasingly precise tools of cartography became instruments not merely of discovery, but of administration and control. As we settled into the previous chapter's exploration of thematic and specialized maps, we watched cartography expand beyond simple location. Now, in this period of vast empires spanning multiple continents, maps became something more. Documents of authority, tools of governance, and sometimes the very substance of disputes between nations. The great European empires of the 1800s understood something fundamental about maps that earlier civilizations had only glimpsed. Whoever controlled the maps often controlled the territory itself. A line drawn on paper in London or Paris or Berlin could determine the fate of peoples thousands of miles away who had never seen that map, never agreed to those boundaries, and often never even knew they had been drawn. The British Empire provides perhaps the most extensive example of cartography in service of administration. The Great Trigonometrical Survey of India, which had begun its meticulous work in earlier decades, continued throughout the century, slowly measuring and mapping the vast subcontinent with unprecedented accuracy. Survey teams hauled their theodolites up mountainsides, established observation points on temple towers, and laid chains across plains to measure exact distances. The resulting maps didn't simply show where things were. They created an administrative framework through which a relatively small number of British officials could govern hundreds of millions of people across an enormous territory. These weren't the decorative maps of earlier centuries, adorned with sea monsters and mythological figures. These were practical, detailed documents showing revenue districts, railway routes, telegraph lines, and administrative boundaries. Every mapped feature served a purpose in the machinery of governance. The maps showed where troops could be stationed, how quickly they could move, where revenues could be collected, and how resources might be extracted and transporting. In Africa, the relationship between mapping and imperial control became particularly apparent during what historians came to call the Scramble for Africa. In 1884, representatives from European nations gathered in Berlin for a conference that would, quite literally, divide an entire continent among themselves. As they negotiated, maps covered the tables before them. Some showed genuine geographical knowledge gathered by explorers and missionaries. Others showed vast blank spaces punctuated by rivers, mountains, and occasional settlements. The diplomats drew lines across these maps with rulers, creating boundaries that often followed convenient geographical features like rivers or meridians of longitude, but which rarely corresponded to the actual territories of the African peoples who lived there. The Congo River became the Belgian King Leopold's personal possession. The Zambezi River marked boundaries between British and Portuguese spheres. A ruler laid against a map in Berlin could separate peoples who had lived as one or unite traditional rivals under a single colonial authority. These maps created what some called paper colonies before they became real ones. A European nation would claim a territory on a map, mark it in their national color, and then face the considerable work of actually establishing authority there. The map came first, the reality followed. Sometimes years would pass before anyone from the claiming nation actually visited the territory they had colored on their maps. The process required surveys, and the imperial powers dispatched survey parties into their claimed territories. These surveyors faced remarkable challenges: hostile climates, tropical diseases, difficult terrain, and often the resistance of local populations who correctly understood that these measurements would lead to their subjugation. Yet the surveys continued, gradually filling in details on the maps, replacing speculation with measured reality. Border disputes between colonial powers often turned on cartographic evidence. When Britain and Venezuela disputed the boundary of British Guiana, both sides produced maps supporting their claims. Earlier maps, perhaps drawn by Spanish or Dutch cartographers, were examined for evidence of historical boundaries. The question of who controlled which territory often came down to which maps could be considered most authoritative, most accurate, or most relevant to the current dispute. In North America, even as the United States expanded westward, maps played a crucial role in defining territories and states. The rectangular boundaries of western states reflect the surveyor's love of straight lines and geometric precision. Unlike the irregular boundaries of eastern states, which often followed rivers and mountain ranges discovered gradually through settlement, many western boundaries were simply drawn as parallels of latitude or meridians of longitude. The surveyors arrived before significant settlement, laying out the public land survey system's grid of townships and sections that would organize land ownership across millions of acres. These survey maps became legal documents. Property deeds referenced specific survey markers, townships, and sections. Disputes over land might be settled by consulting the official survey maps held in government offices. The map wasn't just a representation of reality, it became a legal reality in itself, sometimes more authoritative than what anyone could see on the ground. The imperial powers also discovered that mapping could extend their influence even into territories they didn't directly control. The British Royal Geographical Society sponsored expeditions that mapped regions of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, producing detailed charts that served both scientific and strategic purposes. French cartographers mapped Southeast Asia and North Africa. Russian surveyors worked their way through Central Asia. Each map added to the growing European understanding of global geography, but also to their ability to project power into distant regions. As the century progressed, international boundaries needed increasingly precise definition. No longer was it sufficient to say that a border followed a river. Now diplomats specified which bank, which channel if the river had multiple channels, and what would happen if the river changed course. Mountains that had once served as vague natural boundaries now needed exact survey marks showing where one nation ended and another began. The mapping of empires created documents of remarkable detail and beauty. Cartographers produced atlas volumes showing colonial possessions in various colors, with elaborate keys explaining administrative divisions, transportation networks, and resource locations. These atlases became tools of pride, displaying graphically the extent of a nation's global reach. A British atlas might show possessions colored in red scattered across every continent, a visual representation of the boast that the sun never set on the British Empire. Yet for all their precision and authority, these imperial maps contained a fundamental limitation. They represented one perspective, one way of understanding space and territory. Indigenous peoples had their own mental maps, their own ways of organizing and understanding the landscape, which rarely appeared on the colonial cartographers' carefully surveyed sheets. The official map showed administrative boundaries, but not the traditional territories of pastoral peoples who moved seasonally across those lines. It showed railways and roads, but not the ancient pathways and trade routes that had connected communities for centuries. As the 19th century drew toward its close, the world had been mapped in unprecedented detail, divided and subdivided, measured and marked, all carefully recorded on increasingly accurate charts. The age of blank spaces on maps had largely ended, at least for the major land masses. What remained unmapped would soon yield to new technologies that would allow humanity to see Earth from an entirely new perspective, from above. The 19th century had seen empires drawing lines across continents, claiming territories with increasingly precise maps that defined borders down to the minute of latitude and longitude. Yet for all their mathematical sophistication, these maps still relied on surveyors trudging across land with their instruments, piecing together reality one measured triangle at a time. The view remained stubbornly horizontal, bound to Earth's surface. What cartographers needed, though they scarcely dared imagine it, was a way to rise above the landscape and see it all at once, spread out below like a living map. The dream of flight, of course, was ancient. But when it finally arrived in the late 18th century, it came not through flapping wings or mythical mechanisms, but through the simple physics of hot air rising. The Montgolfier brothers launched their first balloon in 1783, and it wasn't long before someone looked down from those swaying baskets and realized what cartographers had been missing. The first aerial photograph was captured by Nadar, the French photographer and balloonist, hovering above Paris in 1858. The image showed rooftops and streets from an angle no human eye had seen before, except perhaps in imagination. These early aerial views were novelties, curiosities that hinted at possibilities but remained impractical for serious mapmaking. Balloons drifted with the wind, cameras were heavy and slow, and the whole enterprise was weather-dependent and somewhat precarious. Yet military minds recognized the potential immediately. If you could see an enemy's fortifications from above, their carefully concealed positions became obvious patterns of earthworks and trenches. During the American Civil War, both sides experimented with observation balloons, and photographers occasionally managed to capture images from these unstable platforms, though the results were rarely clear enough for detailed mapping. The breakthrough came when flight itself became controllable. The Wright brothers' success at Kitty Hawk in 1903 opened possibilities that balloons could never achieve. By the time the First World War began in 1914, aircraft had advanced just enough to carry cameras aloft and return them safely. What started as reconnaissance quickly evolved into systematic photography. Pilots would fly predetermined routes while cameras clicked away, capturing overlapping images of the landscape below. Back at headquarters, these photographs could be assembled into mosaics, creating maps of unprecedented detail and accuracy. The view from above revealed patterns invisible from ground level. Roads became threads connecting settlements. Rivers showed their full meandering paths without the obstruction of valley walls. Field boundaries, building footprints, and forest edges appeared with perfect clarity. More importantly, aerial photographs couldn't lie or embellish in the way that ground-based surveys might. They captured what was actually there, with all its irregularities and surprises. After the war, civilian applications multiplied. Government mapping agencies realized that aerial photography could accomplish in days what took surveyors months or years to achieve. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, systematic aerial surveys began covering entire regions. The technique was particularly valuable in remote or difficult terrain where ground surveys were expensive and dangerous. Pilots flew grid patterns over mountains, forests, and deserts, their cameras recording everything below. The technology improved with each passing year. Better cameras, better film, better aircraft that could fly higher and more steadily. Cartographers developed stereoscopic techniques, using pairs of overlapping photographs to create three-dimensional views that revealed elevation and terrain features. Special viewers allowed them to see hills and valleys in miniature, measuring heights and depths with remarkable precision. The flat photographs, when viewed correctly, contained depth information that could be extracted and translated into the contour lines that gave maps their sculptural quality. The Second World War accelerated these developments dramatically. Both sides invested heavily in aerial reconnaissance, producing millions of photographs. Interpreters learned to read these images with extraordinary skill, identifying vehicle types from their shadows, estimating troop numbers from track patterns, and detecting camouflaged installations from subtle variations in tone and texture. The accumulated expertise transformed aerial photography from a simple recording technique into a sophisticated intelligence tool. After 1945, this military technology flowed into civilian mapping programs. National surveys became more comprehensive and accurate. The United States Geological Survey, Britain's Ordnance Survey, and similar agencies worldwide made aerial photography the foundation of their mapping operations. Remote regions that had appeared blank or speculative on earlier maps now revealed their true geography. The interiors of continents, island chains, polar regions, all gradually came into focus through the camera's unblinking eye. Then, in October 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, and humanity's view expanded beyond the atmosphere itself. The first artificial satellite was a simple sphere with radio transmitters, but it proved that spacecraft could orbit Earth successfully. Within a few years, satellites carried cameras, and those cameras looked down at the planet below with a perspective even more comprehensive than aircraft could achieve. The early satellite images were crude by later standards, but they showed something extraordinary. Entire weather systems spiraling across oceans, continental coastlines curving away toward the horizon, the planet as a complete system rather than a collection of separate regions. The first photograph of Earth from space, taken by a V-2 rocket in 1946, had been a grainy black and white image. By the 1960s, satellites were returning images that showed Earth's beauty and complexity in stunning detail. For cartographers, satellites offered unprecedented advantages. They could photograph vast areas in single images, showing how features related across hundreds of miles. They returned to the same locations on regular schedules, documenting seasonal changes and long-term transformations. They operated regardless of political boundaries, seeing the same things over friendly and hostile territory alike. The view from orbit was impartial and comprehensive. The Landsat program, begun in 1972, specifically targeted mapping and Earth observation. Its satellites circled the planet repeatedly, building up complete coverage that was updated regularly. Each image contained multiple wavelengths of light, including infrared bands invisible to human eyes, but revealing vegetation health, water content, and geological features. Cartographers could now create maps showing not just where things were, but what condition they were in, how they changed across seasons, and how human activity was reshaping the landscape. This transformation happened quietly but completely. By the late 20th century, virtually every modern map began with satellite imagery or aerial photography as its foundation. The old methods of ground surveying didn't disappear entirely, but they became supplementary, filling in details and verifying what the view from above had already revealed. Mapmaking had reversed its perspective. Instead of piecing together the world from countless local observations, cartographers now started with the complete picture and worked their way into finer detail. The implications rippled through many fields. Environmental scientists could track deforestation, urban sprawl, and coastline erosion with precision. Agricultural planners could assess crop health across entire regions. Disaster responders could see the extent of floods, fires, and storms. Archaeologists discovered previously unknown ancient sites visible only from above, their subtle traces invisible to observers on the ground, but obvious to cameras in space. As night settles around us now, satellites continue their silent circuits overhead, their cameras and sensors recording Earth's ever-changing surface. The maps they help create are more accurate and comprehensive than anything previous generations could have imagined. Yet the fundamental human impulse remains unchanged, the same desire that drove ancient Mesopotamians to scratch marks in clay, to understand where we are, to represent the world around us, and to share that knowledge with others. The tools have changed beyond recognition, but the purpose endures, connecting us across millennia of human curiosity and ingenuity. The transformation began quietly in the 1960s, in university laboratories and government research centers, where computers the size of rooms hummed and clicked through their calculations. For centuries, mapmakers had worked with ink and paper, their hands steady as they traced coastlines and marked elevations. Now, for the first time, the ancient art of cartography was about to encounter the digital age. The earliest computer maps were crude things, almost unrecognizable compared to the elegant hand-drawn charts that had guided ships across oceans. Printers produced maps using only the characters available on a typewriter, creating coastlines from rows of X's and O's, showing elevations through patterns of asterisks and dollar signs. To the trained cartographers who had spent years perfecting their lettering and line work, these primitive outputs must have seemed like a step backward. Yet something profound was happening. The computer could store vast amounts of geographic information and manipulate it in ways that had never been possible before. In 1964, a Harvard laboratory began developing what would become one of the first true computer mapping systems. Researchers worked to digitize geographic data, converting the curves and colors of traditional maps into strings of numbers that computers could process. The work was painstaking. Each point on a map had to be given coordinates. Each line had to be broken down into a series of connected points. Every boundary, every road, every river became a collection of mathematical values stored in the computer's memory. The revolution truly began when cartographers realized they could separate different types of information into layers. A traditional paper map showed everything at once. Roads, rivers, cities, elevation contours, all printed together on a single surface. But in the computer, each type of feature could occupy its own layer, like transparent sheets stacked upon one another. You could turn layers on or off, combine them in different ways, and create custom maps for specific purposes. A city planner could display water pipes and property boundaries. A biologist could overlay wildlife habitats with vegetation types. The same geographic foundation could serve countless different needs. This concept evolved into what became known as Geographic Information Systems, or GIS. In the 1960s, a Canadian researcher named Roger Tomlinson developed a system to analyze land use and agricultural capability across the vast expanses of Canada. His Canada Geographic Information System was the first to use the term and demonstrated how computers could not just draw maps, but analyze spatial relationships. The computer could answer questions that would take humans months to figure out by hand. How much forested land lies within this watershed? Which parcels have soil suitable for particular crops? Where should a new road be placed to minimize environmental impact? Through the 1970s and 1980s, as computers became more powerful and less expensive, digital cartography spread from research institutions to government agencies and private companies. The United States Geological Survey began the enormous task of digitizing all its topographic maps, converting decades of surveying work into computer databases. The process took years, requiring workers to trace over paper maps on special digitizing tablets that recorded the position of every point. Meanwhile, other technologies were converging with computer mapping in ways that would prove transformative. Remote sensing satellites were sending back increasingly detailed images of Earth's surface. Computer programs could process these images, identifying features automatically and updating maps with current information. For the first time in history, maps could stay completely current, incorporating new data as it arrived rather than waiting years for new additions to be surveyed, drawn, and printed. The transition was not always smooth. Traditional cartographers had developed sophisticated techniques over centuries for deciding what to show, what to emphasize, and how to make a map both accurate and readable. Computers followed only the instructions they were given. Early digital maps often looked cluttered and confusing, lacking the careful judgment about line weights, label placement, and visual hierarchy that skilled human mapmakers brought to their work. Gradually, programmers learned to encode these aesthetic principles into their software, teaching computers the subtle art of good map design. By the 1990s, digital cartography had reached a tipping point. Most professional mapmaking now happened on computer screens rather than at drafting tables. Software packages allowed users to create sophisticated maps without years of training in traditional techniques. Data could be shared instantly across computer networks. A researcher in one country could access geographic data from another and incorporate it into their own maps within minutes. The real transformation for everyday people came with the development of mapping software that could run on personal computers. Instead of purchasing expensive atlases that were outdated as soon as they were printed, someone could buy a CD-ROM containing detailed street maps of an entire country. The computer screen became a window into geographic information that could be searched, zoomed, and customized in ways no paper map ever could. Type in an address, and the computer would find it instantly, something that might take minutes of index consulting with a traditional atlas. Perhaps the most significant development was the ability to calculate routes. Given a starting point and a destination, the computer could analyze the network of roads and determine the shortest or fastest path between them. This calculation, which might take a human considerable time with a paper map and a ruler, happened in seconds. The software could even adjust recommendations based on current traffic conditions if that data was available, choosing alternate routes to avoid congestion. As the internet spread through the late 1990s, Maps began migrating from CD-ROMs to websites. Now the information didn't even need to be stored on your own computer. Companies built vast geographic databases accessible through a web browser. The maps could be updated continuously, reflecting road changes, new businesses, current construction. Users could contribute information, reporting errors, or adding details about places they knew well. Cartography was becoming collaborative in ways that would have been impossible in the era of hand-drawn maps. The digital revolution in cartography represented more than just a change in tools. It fundamentally altered what a map could be. A paper map was fixed, permanent, the same for everyone who unfolded it. A digital map was fluid, customizable, interactive. It could show you where you are right now, calculate where you're going, and adapt as circumstances change. The ancient dream of perfect, current, personalized geographic knowledge was becoming reality, pixel by pixel, in the glow of computer screens around the world. Yet even as these powerful systems developed, they remained tethered to computers, desktop machines, or laptops. The next revolution would come when all this cartographic power could fit in your pocket, ready to guide you anywhere, anytime. The digital revolution had transformed cartography into something accessible to specialists and enthusiasts alike. But the true democratization of maps was yet to come. That final transformation would arrive not through large institutions or government agencies, but through a constellation of satellites orbiting silently above our heads and small devices carried in millions of pockets. The Global Positioning System, or GPS, had its origins in Cold War military technology. The United States Department of Defense launched the first experimental satellites in the late 1970s, creating a network that would eventually consist of at least 24 satellites arranged in precise orbits. Each satellite carried atomic clocks of extraordinary accuracy, broadcasting signals that contained their position and the exact time. A receiver on Earth, listening to signals from multiple satellites, could calculate its own position through a process of mathematical triangulation. The system became fully operational in 1995, and though initially restricted for civilian use, it would soon become the foundation for a revolution in personal navigation. In the year 2000, a decision was made to remove the intentional degradation of civilian GPS signals, a practice called selective availability. Overnight, the accuracy available to ordinary users improved dramatically, from about 100 meters to within 15 meters or better. This single policy change opened vast possibilities for civilian applications of satellite positioning. The first portable GPS receivers had been bulky, expensive devices used primarily by surveyors, hikers, and maritime navigators. They displayed coordinates and basic maps on small monochrome screens, requiring users to understand latitude and longitude. But as the technology matured and costs declined, these devices became smaller and more sophisticated. Automotive GPS navigation systems emerged, speaking turn-by-turn directions in reassuring voices, transforming road trips and daily commutes alike. Then came the smartphone revolution. When Apple introduced the iPhone in 2007, followed by countless competitors and innovations, these devices quickly incorporated GPS receivers alongside their computing and communication capabilities. Suddenly, hundreds of millions of people carried computers in their pockets, computers that knew precisely where they were at any given moment. The implications of this convergence were profound. Google Maps, which had launched as a desktop web service in 2005, became a mobile application that could show not just any location on Earth, but your current location displayed as a pulsing blue dot on a detailed map. The ancient cartographic question of "where am I?" could now be answered instantly anywhere on the planet with a clear view of the sky. These pocket maps were unlike any that had come before. They were not static images, but dynamic interfaces, continuously updated with new information. Traffic conditions appeared in real time, colored overlays showing where roads were flowing freely and where congestion slowed movement to a crawl. Transit schedules integrated with walking directions. Reviews and photographs appeared for businesses and landmarks. The maps learned from the collective behavior of their users, detecting traffic patterns and suggesting faster routes. The navigation capabilities that would have seemed like magic to Mercator or Cook became commonplace. A person could stand on an unfamiliar street corner in a foreign city and know immediately where they were, which direction they faced, and how to walk to any destination they desired. The smartphone would speak gentle instructions, recalculating patiently whenever the user took a wrong turn or chose to deviate from the suggested path. But these pocket maps offered more than navigation. They became tools for discovery and exploration of a different kind. A hiker could record a trail, creating a precise track log that showed not just the route, but also elevation gained, distance traveled, and speed. A traveler could mark favorite locations, building a personal atlas of meaningful places. Parents could share their locations with family members, creating invisible threads of connection across distances. The technology behind these capabilities grew increasingly sophisticated. Smartphones began combining GPS data with signals from cellular towers and Wi-Fi networks, improving accuracy and enabling positioning even inside buildings where satellite signals couldn't penetrate. Accelerometers and gyroscopes added information about movement and orientation. Cameras enabled augmented reality applications that could overlay directions and information onto live views of the world. By the 2010s, several billion people had access to these tools. In many parts of the world, populations who had never owned traditional paper maps or atlases gained instant access to detailed cartographic information through inexpensive smartphones. Street views provided photographic tour of distant cities. Satellite imagery allowed anyone to examine their own neighborhood from space. Three-dimensional terrain models let users fly over mountain ranges and canyons. The impact on human behavior was subtle but significant. The skill of reading paper maps, once essential for navigation, became less common. The ability to maintain a mental map of one's surroundings, to know instinctively which direction led home or how streets connected, perhaps diminished for some who relied entirely on digital guidance. Yet new capabilities emerged. The confidence to explore unfamiliar places, the ability to find optimal routes, the freedom to wander knowing that one could always find the way back. These maps also changed commerce and social interaction. Delivery drivers navigated efficiently to countless addresses. Ride-sharing services matched passengers with drivers using real-time location data. Friends coordinated meetings by sharing their positions. Emergency services could locate callers in distress with unprecedented accuracy. The maps themselves became collaborative creations. Projects like OpenStreetMap allowed volunteers worldwide to contribute local knowledge, mapping footpaths, buildings, and features that commercial services might overlook. Millions of users submitted corrections, updates, and reviews, making the maps more accurate and comprehensive with each passing day. In this sense, the ancient collaborative nature of cartography, where knowledge accumulated over generations of travelers and observers, found new expression in digital form. As we rest here now, thinking about this journey through the history of maps, we can appreciate how far the art and science of cartography has traveled. From scratches on clay tablets showing the boundaries of fields, to satellites broadcasting signals from space that tell us our position within meters, the human drive to know where we are and how to represent that knowledge has remained constant. The tools have changed beyond recognition, but the fundamental questions remain the same. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, millions of satellites circle overhead in their precise orbits, their atomic clocks ticking with extraordinary accuracy, their signals reaching down to billions of devices below. The whole Earth has been mapped, measured, photographed, and rendered accessible to anyone with a small screen and a connection to the global network of information. The blank spaces on maps have been filled. The unknown territories have been charted. Yet in making the world completely knowable, we have perhaps created new opportunities for wonder, new ways to explore and understand our planet and our place upon it. As we bring to a close our journey through the remarkable story of maps, from the first attempts to sketch our world on parchment to the intricate charts that guided brave explorers across uncharted seas, we hope these tales have gently carried you toward rest. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful exploration of how humanity learned to draw the lines that connect us all. If these calm adventures have brought you comfort, we'd love to have you with us again. Please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below to help other smart sleepers find their way here. And now, as the night deepens and your mind settles like an anchor finding its place, we wish you the sweetest of dreams. Good night, fellow dreamer, and may your sleep be restful and your dreams be kind.